What's up, guys? Welcome to Watch Harry. We've got something special today. What if Petunia discovered she was a squib with inheritance and raised Harry to destroy Dumbledore's reputation? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The letter he never sent her. The doorstep was cold. Petunia noticed that first, the cold seeping through the bottom of the door, pressing against her bare feet where the draft came in, even in November, even with the weather stripping Vernon had replaced twice already. She had come downstairs for a glass of water. She hadn't been sleeping well. She hadn't been sleeping well for a week, actually, since the news had been spreading in the strange, sideways way that news spread when it involved that world, a whisper from Mrs. Fig 2 doors down, a barn owl that had landed on the kitchen windowsill and then flown away before she could read what it carried, the feeling in her chest like a tuning fork struck against bone. Lily was dead. She knew. She'd known before any official word arrived, before any owl or messenger or magical post could have crossed whatever distance separated number 4 Privet Drive from wherever her sister had been living and dying and fighting. She'd known the way she always knew things about the magical world, not through casting, not through any power she could demonstrate or prove, but through feeling it. That copperan electricity sensation she'd had her whole life, the awareness that magic was real and present and moving through the world like weather. She felt it the way some people felt changes in barometric pressure in their joints, a deep, inarticulate certainty. 2 days ago, it had felt like a bell being shattered mid-ring. She'd sat down in the kitchen at 2 in the morning and put her face in her hands and not cried. She'd made tea instead, and drunk it standing over the sink, staring at the dark window, and made herself be very still until the worst of it passed. Now it was 4 in the morning and she was standing at the front door because something had woken her, not a sound, not a knock, just that copper bell sensation, sharp and insistent, pulling her downstairs like a hand at her collar. She opened the door. The bundle on the step was wrapped in a blanket that was clearly not from any shop on Privet Drive or anywhere near it. The wool was too fine and too strange a color, somewhere between cream and silver, and it moved slightly in the night air as though breathing on its own. Above the blanket's edge, a sleeping face. Dark hair going in 17 directions at once. One tiny fist pressed against a round cheek. And on the baby's forehead, just visible at the hairline, a cut in the shape of a lightning bolt. Still pink. Still new. Petunia stood there for a long moment, the cold coming up through the soles of her feet and the November air pressing against her face, and she felt the full weight of what she was looking at settle over her like something vast and inevitable. Harry. Lily's boy. There was a letter tucked into the blanket. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she even picked it up. She'd seen that handwriting once before, when she was 11 years old and Lily was 9, and a letter had arrived at breakfast addressed to Lily with a Hogwarts seal, and 3 days later a man with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles had come to their sitting room and smiled at Lily like she was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever seen, and then turned that same smile on Petunia, but smaller, just slightly, just enough, and said the words that had shaped the next 20 years of her life. We did test for magical ability, yes. In cases such as Petunia's, the results are quite conclusive. She is, I'm afraid, not one of us. Not one of us. She picked up Harry with one arm, careful, automatic, she had held babies before, she knew how, and tucked the letter under her other arm, and went inside, and closed the door. She put Harry on the sofa, surrounded by cushions, and sat in the armchair across from him and opened the letter. It was everything she expected and nothing she wanted. Dumbledore's voice came through the parchment as clearly as if he were sitting across from her, measured, warm, absolutely certain of itself. He explained about Voldemort. He explained about the prophecy, in the vaguest possible terms. He explained about the blood wards, how Lily's sacrifice had created a magical protection tied to her blood, and how that blood lived in Petunia, and how as long as Harry could call this house home, Voldemort's remaining followers could not touch him. He explained that Harry was famous now, that the wizarding world was celebrating, that it would be better, safer, for Harry to grow up away from all of that, away from the weight of expectation, humble and quiet and unknowing, until the time came when he was needed. Until the time came when he was needed. Petunia read that sentence 3 times. She set the letter down on the coffee table, very carefully, as though it might burn. For a long time she just sat there with her sleeping nephew between them and Dumbledore's handwriting on the table, and she thought about Lily. Not the Lily from the past few years, the letters that had grown shorter and more careful, the visits that had stopped happening, the gap that had opened between them when Lily married James Potter and the war became something real and present rather than something Petunia read about in the notes she was never supposed to have. She thought about the Lily who was 9 years old and sitting at breakfast when the Hogwarts letter arrived, who had turned to Petunia with jam on her fingers and her eyes gone huge and said Toonie, Toonie, look, and Petunia had looked, and felt it. That copper-electric sensation. Magic is real, magic is here, magic is in this envelope. She had felt it, and 2 years later Dumbledore had told her she wasn't one of them, and Lily had gone away to a world Petunia could feel but never enter, and 22 years after that Lily was dead and her baby was on Petunia's sofa wrapped in wool that moved like breathing. She looked at Harry. He had Lily's coloring under the black hair. The same shaped mouth. She thought, Dumbledore used her. Not carelessly. Not cruelly, in the way that people are cruel because they enjoy it. Worse than that. He had looked at Lily, bright, powerful, extraordinary Lily with her talent for charms and her fierce heart, and he had seen a weapon worth cultivating. He had shaped a generation of magical children for a war that he had perhaps not started but had certainly refused to end. Petunia had spent years piecing this together from Lily's letters, from things Lily had said without quite saying them, from the Squib networks, the quietly existing communities of people like her, people who could sense magic but not wield it, who passed information in the margins of the magical world because no one thought they mattered enough to watch. She knew more about Albus Dumbledore than he would ever have imagined she did, and what she knew made her hands very steady and very cold. He had known about the prophecy before Voldemort had. He had chosen not to better protect the Potters. He had allowed the knowledge of the prophecy to leak through channels he controlled. He had made James and Lily into martyrs because martyrs were more useful than survivors. And now he wanted to do the same thing to Harry. Until the time came when he was needed. Petunia picked up the letter again and read it to the end this time. The last paragraph was the one she would think about for years afterward, the one that told her, in Dumbledore's beautifully constructed sentences, that Harry had a destiny. That the wizarding world needed him. That his life would serve a greater purpose, and that Petunia, if she loved her nephew, would understand this and raise him accordingly. He was asking her to raise Harry ignorant. Ignorant of his inheritance, his family, his world. Ignorant of the prophecy, of what had really happened to his parents, of the financial empire the Potters represented. He wanted Harry to arrive at Hogwarts at 11 years old knowing nothing, overwhelmed, grateful, malleable. He wanted a child who would trust completely, follow instructions completely, die if necessary completely. He did not know what Petunia Evans was. She folded the letter. She set it down. She stood up and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because certain decisions required tea, and while she waited for it to boil she began, very quietly, very methodically, to think. She had resources. Not wealth. Vernon was a sales manager for a drill company, they were comfortable but not rich, but resources in the truest sense. She had the Squib network, which was more useful than most people knew. She had 11 years of collected knowledge about the wizarding world, built from letters and overheard conversations and the occasional document passed to her by contacts who owed favors. She had the contents of a safety deposit box in a Guildford bank that had belonged to her father, who had also been, quietly, privately, never discussed, aware of what Petunia was and who had spent the last years of his life quietly gathering what information he could for her sake. She had Harry. Lily's blood. Potter blood. And she had, she thought, something Dumbledore had never once considered she might possess, a complete and total absence of loyalty to his version of the truth. The kettle boiled. She made 2 cups of tea. She carried both upstairs, set one on Vernon's nightstand, and gently put her hand on his shoulder. He woke the way he always did, Vernon, sudden and disoriented, blinking against the bedside lamp she'd clicked on. Petunia? What's? He saw her face and sat up properly. What's happened? Lily's baby is on the sofa, she said. His name is Harry. He has a lightning bolt scar on his forehead and I need to tell you some things. Drink your tea. Vernon looked at her for a long moment in the way he sometimes did, that particular look he'd had since they first started dating, the one that meant he understood there were depths to his wife that he couldn't fully map but chose to love anyway. He reached out and took her hand. All right, he said. Tell me. So she did. She told him everything. Not the softened version, not the carefully managed version she'd deployed over the years when magic-adjacent things required small explanations. The full version, starting at the beginning, what she was, what she could feel, what Dumbledore had said when she was 11, what she'd spent the subsequent years learning. She told him about the Squib networks and her father's safety deposit box. She told him about Lily's letters and the war and what she believed had really happened. She told him about the blood wards and the prophecy and the letter downstairs with its beautiful, poisonous last paragraph. Vernon listened. He was not a subtle man or a clever one, but he was steady, and he loved Petunia in a way that had always been more useful to her than cleverness. When she finished, he drank the rest of his tea in 3 swallows and set the mug down. So Dumbledore, he said. This old wizard. He's the one who let Lily and James get killed. Indirectly. Perhaps. I believe so. And he wants to do the same thing to Harry. In time, yes. And he left the baby on our doorstep without asking. Yes. Vernon thought about this for a moment. His jaw did something complicated. Right, he said. So we're going to raise Harry. Yes. And we're going to raise him properly. Knowing things. Knowing everything, Petunia said. As much as I can give him. Vernon nodded slowly. He wasn't looking at her with the expression of a man being dragged somewhere uncomfortable. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just been handed a purpose. And this Dumbledore. He's going to try to interfere? Eventually. When Harry is older and useful to him, yes. Right. Vernon got up, which given that it was 4:30 in the morning and he had work tomorrow was a significant gesture. He walked to the door, paused, and turned back. I'll go make up the spare room. We'll need a proper cot, I'll pick one up Saturday. And Petunia. He met her eyes. I know the magic stuff has been difficult for me. But he's your blood. He's family. I meant what I said at the wedding, all right? Your family is mine. She looked at him, this solid, ordinary, well-meaning man she'd married, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 days eased the smallest fraction. Go make up the spare room, she said. I'll sit with him. She went back downstairs and settled into the armchair across from the sofa, and while Harry slept and the house breathed around her and the first grey light began to suggest itself at the edges of the curtains, she took a notepad from the side table drawer and began to write. Not to Dumbledore. She would not be writing to Dumbledore. If he expected a response to his letter, he could wait until he had a very long beard, which, she noted, he already did. She was writing to Gringotts Bank. She knew it could be done. The Squib network had passed her documents, years ago, that confirmed a legal mechanism she suspected Dumbledore hoped most people didn't know existed. Under wizarding law, a Squib with direct blood relation to a magical individual could petition for guardianship access to that individual's financial and legal records, in cases where no other magical guardian had been formally designated. It was an obscure law, dusty and rarely used, a relic of times when Squib relatives were considered meaningful participants in wizarding families rather than embarrassments to be quietly forgotten. She was about to find it very useful. The letter she wrote was precise and formal, in the language she'd learned from her father's documents. She cited the relevant statute numbers. She identified herself as Petunia Desley, née Evans, Squib-born, maternal aunt and currently residing primary guardian of one Harry James Potter, minor, born July 31, 1980. She requested a full accounting of the Potter estate. She requested documentation of all legal and financial decisions made regarding said estate since October 31, 1981. She requested, specifically, any record of guardianship documents, trust fund dispensations, and any instrument signed in the name of or on behalf of Harry James Potter by any party other than his designated legal guardian. She signed it neatly, folded it, and set it aside to address once she'd located the appropriate barn owl to send it with. Then she set down the pen and looked at Harry again. He had woken slightly, not crying, just that particular half-aware state of very small children, his eyes not quite focusing, one fist pressed against his mouth. The lightning bolt scar on his forehead caught the growing morning light. Petunia got up and picked him up, and he made a small sound and burrowed against her shoulder with the absolute trust of something very young that hasn't yet learned there are things not worth trusting. "Right," she said, very quietly, into his ridiculous hair. "Here's what's going to happen. I am going to raise you. Not for him. Not for any prophecy or war or greater good or whatever spectacular story Dumbledore has ready for you. I'm going to raise you as your mother's son, and your father's son, and my nephew, and a person with a brain in his head and the full facts of his situation in that brain." She paused. "You have no idea what I'm saying. That's fine. I'll repeat it until it takes." Harry made another small sound. His hand found her collar and gripped it. "He told me I wasn't one of you," Petunia said. "When I was 11. He said I wasn't magical enough to matter. And then he spent 20 years treating your mother like she mattered too much, like she was so extraordinary that it was fine to spend her on a war." Her voice stayed level. She had made her peace with a great deal over the years, not through acceptance but through conversion, turning grief into fuel, turning exclusion into advantage. "He doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know what I've been doing. He doesn't know about the network, or your father's files, or the vault your grandfather set up that isn't listed under any Potter name and that I have the key to." She adjusted her grip on Harry. "He thinks I'm a bitter, small woman who resented her magical sister and will raise her orphaned nephew to be small and bitter himself. He thinks I'm exactly what he made me." She went to the window. Outside, Privet Drive was grey-pink with early morning, a milk float humming somewhere at the end of the street, the suburban world doing its steady ordinary thing. "He made a mistake," she said. "Several, actually. But the biggest one was deciding I didn't matter." She looked at Harry's face. "I've had 20 years to study him. To learn everything I could about how he works, what he values, how he builds his image. He's brilliant, I'll give him that. He's built something extraordinary, not just a reputation, a mythology. The greatest wizard alive, the defeater of Grindelwald, the wise old man who stands between the world and darkness." She paused. "Mythologies have seams. You find the seams, you pull, and the whole thing comes apart. Not with violence. With truth. He can defend against curses. He cannot defend against facts in the public record." Harry had fallen back asleep. The fist was still gripping her collar. "You are going to be extraordinary," Petunia said. "Not because of some prophecy. Because you are Lily's son, and Lily was the most remarkable person I've ever known, and whatever she put into you before she died is already written in the way you're looking at the world even now." She touched the lightning bolt scar, very gently, with one finger. "And because I am going to give you every single thing I was denied. Every piece of information. Every connection. Every legal and financial and historical record I can get my hands on. You are going to arrive at whatever war he has planned for you knowing exactly where every body is buried." She carried him upstairs. Vernon had made up the spare room with a speed and competence that she found, as she always found it, quietly touching. There was a drawer pulled out and padded with folded blankets as a makeshift cot, which would do until Saturday's proper one. Vernon himself had gone back to bed, which was sensible, but had left the nightlight on. She put Harry in the drawer cot and stood over him for a moment, this child who was a prophecy and an inconvenience and a weapon in someone else's war, and who was also just her nephew, just a baby with James's hair and Lily's eyes, currently sleeping with his mouth slightly open. "We'll start with maths," she said. "Then reading. Then history, the real sort. Then money, because money is where the truth always hides." She paused. "Then when you're old enough, we'll talk about him." She went to her father's old desk in the corner of the room. She'd had it moved up here when they first took the house, for reasons she hadn't fully understood at the time, and opened the bottom drawer. Under the false panel at the back, where her father had kept it, was a small leather-bound ledger, very old, with a Gringotts seal embossed on the front cover. She took it out and held it and thought about her father, who had been a squib himself and had died not knowing what his careful, quiet work would eventually become. Who had spent his life gathering information from the edges of a world that excluded him, and had left it all to her. "You'll know what to do with it, pet," he'd told her, near the end. "When the time comes, you'll know." She looked at the ledger. She looked at Harry. She looked at Dumbledore's letter, which she'd carried up without thinking and which now sat on the desk corner. Then she opened the desk drawer, took out an envelope, addressed it to Gringotts Bank, London, and slipped her carefully written letter inside. She did not seal it immediately. Instead she uncapped a pen and added a postscript at the bottom. "Please note that I am aware of Statute 47C regarding Squib inheritance access. I am also aware that Statute 47C has not been invoked in 73 years, and that there are parties who have reason to prefer it remain uninvoked. I am prepared to pursue this through the full Wiesengemot if necessary. I do not anticipate it will be necessary. Gringotts and I want the same thing, an accurate accounting of what is owed to whom." She sealed the envelope. Outside, the milk float had finished its round. The first birds were beginning in the gardens along Privet Drive. November light, thin and pewter-colored, was filling the room. Harry made a sound in his sleep, not distress, more like someone working through a complicated problem, and his hand opened and closed. Petunia sat down in her father's desk chair and watched him breathe, and planned, and waited for morning. She thought about the last letter Lily had sent her, 3 months ago. It had been short, shorter than usual, and carefully worded in the way that letters were when the writer knew they might be intercepted. But Lily had added something at the end, in smaller writing, almost as an afterthought. "I keep thinking about you, Toonie. About how you always knew things you weren't supposed to know. About how unfair it was. I'm sorry I didn't say that more." Petunia had carried that letter in her cardigan pocket for a week. She reached into that same cardigan now, out of habit, and found it still there, soft at the folds from a week of being carried. She took it out and held it for a moment, and then set it next to the Gringotts letter on the desk, and smoothed both pieces of paper flat. "I'm going to fix it," she told Lily, "or the room, or no one in particular. Not just for him. For you, too. For what he made of you." She paused. "I know you believed in him. I know you thought it was worth it. But it wasn't, Lily. It was never worth it. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows." When Vernon came down at 7 for his breakfast, he found Petunia in the kitchen with the Gringotts letter sealed and addressed on the table, 2 more pages of handwritten notes beside it, and a baby asleep in a sling she had improvised from a large scarf and a belt, snoring against her collarbone. "Right," he said, looking at the baby and the notes and his wife's expression, which was the expression of a person who has made a decision so complete it needs no announcement. He filled the kettle. "I'll ring in sick today. Help you get sorted." "You don't have to, I want to," he said. "He's ours, isn't he?" Petunia looked at Harry's sleeping face, the impractical hair, the small curved scar. "Yes," she said. He's ours. She picked up the pen again. There were so many letters left to write, and morning was just beginning, and she had the very pleasant feeling of someone who has just picked up a thread and is beginning to see, for the first time, the shape of the whole cloth. Dumbledore had 20 years to build his fortress of reputation and mythology. Petunia had Harry's whole childhood to take it apart. She thought, quietly, that 20 years might be more than enough. Chapter 2, What Goblins Know. The thing about Gringotts was that the goblins didn't care who you were. That was the first lesson Petunia had learned from her father's ledger, and the most important one. They didn't care about blood status or magical ability or the carefully maintained social hierarchies of Wizarding Britain. They cared about contracts, records, and the accurate movement of gold. They cared about what was owed and what had been taken, and the difference between those two numbers was, to a goblin, a matter of near religious significance. This made them, Petunia had concluded, the most reliable institution in the wizarding world. The response to her letter came 11 days after she sent it, not by owl, which would have been traceable, but delivered by a small, very composed goblin who knocked on the front door of number 4 at precisely 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, handed Petunia a sealed package with the Gringotts crest pressed deep in the wax, said, "Account Liaison Sharpfang requests a meeting at your earliest convenience, Mrs. Dursley," and departed before she could do more than nod. Vernon, who had been eating toast in the kitchen doorway, watched the goblin walk back down the front path and then looked at his wife. Harry, 5 months old and increasingly opinionated about it, was balanced on Petunia's hip examining the package with the intense focus of someone who has recently discovered that objects exist. "Should I take the day off?" Vernon asked. "Wednesday would be better," Petunia said, already breaking the wax seal. "I'll need you with Harry while I go in." "You're going to London?" Diagon Alley. She unfolded the letter inside and read it quickly. Sharpfang's writing was precise and sparing, exactly what she'd expected. "The matters raised in your correspondence are of significant interest to Gringotts. We confirm the statutes cited. A full accounting has been prepared. Please attend at your earliest convenience with the following documentation." Below that, a list. "Yes. Wednesday." She lowered the letter and looked at Harry, who had managed to grab a corner of the envelope and was currently attempting to eat it. "Not yet," she said, removing it gently. "That's important." Harry looked at her with Lily's eyes and expressed his opinion of the envelope situation in terms that were not words but were perfectly legible nonetheless. "Don't be dramatic," Petunia said. "You get that from your grandfather Potter." She went on Wednesday. She dressed carefully, not in anything that tried to look magical, but in the sort of sharp, well-cut professional wear that said "I am a person who takes meetings seriously," which was true and useful in any world. She took the train to London and walked into the leaky cauldron with the steady, unremarkable confidence of someone who has entered buildings like this a handful of times before and been entirely unmoved by them. Tom the barman blinked at her but said nothing. She tapped the bricks in the back wall with the small brass tip of the umbrella she carried specifically for this purpose. She couldn't use a wand, had never been able to, but the network had long since worked out that certain non-magical tools could interact with magical entry points if you knew the exact sequence, and Diagon Alley opened in front of her. She walked through it without gawking. She had been here twice before, both times with her father, both times for similar reasons. She was aware of the looks she attracted, not hostile, exactly, but curious in the sideways manner of a world unused to people who moved through it without the particular crackling energy of active magic. She filed the looks away and kept walking. Gringotts was exactly as she remembered, vast and white and faintly threatening in the way of all institutions that are genuinely more powerful than the governments nominally above them. The goblin at the front desk looked at her with the professional expressionlessness of someone who has evaluated thousands of humans and found the whole species mildly tedious. "Petunia Dursley," she said. "I have an appointment with Sharpfang." The goblin checked something in a ledger, made a small note, and gestured for her to follow a second goblin who appeared from a door to the left. She was led not into the main banking hall but down a corridor that went sideways from it, deeper into the building, and into a room that looked like a library had mated with an accountant's office, shelves of documents in identical leather folders, a large desk, a window that showed no outside view but emitted a cool white light, and behind the desk a goblin who was older than any she'd seen, sharp-eyed and still, with a stillness that was not patience but calculation. "Mrs. Dursley," Sharpfang said. The voice was dry and precise. "Please sit." She sat. She placed her documentation on the desk, the copies of relevant statutes, her proof of identity, 2 documents from her father's ledger that she'd had independently verified, and folded her hands. Sharpfang looked at the documents for exactly 30 seconds, then looked at her. "You understand what you're asking for?" "I asked for a full accounting of the Potter estate," Petunia said. "And documentation of any legal or financial instruments signed on Harry Potter's behalf since October 31st. "Yes." Sharpfang opened a folder on the desk. "And you understand that what we've found in preparing that accounting is considerably more than a standard estate review." "I expected it might be." Sharpfang looked at her for a moment with those sharp, flat eyes, and Petunia had the distinct impression of being assessed, not for trustworthiness, exactly, goblins didn't really operate on trust, but for usefulness. For whether she was the sort of person who would take what she was given and actually do something productive with it. She met the gaze evenly. "Very well," Sharpfang said, and began. It took 2 hours. Petunia had brought a notepad and wrote in her small, precise hand without pause throughout. By the end of the first hour her handwriting had gotten slightly smaller, she was running out of page, and her jaw had taken on a set that, had Vernon been there to observe it, he would have recognized as the expression his wife wore when she was furious and choosing, deliberately, to be very calm about it instead. The Potter estate was substantial. That much she'd known. The Potters were an old family with old money and older magical lineage, and the estate reflected this: properties, vaults, investments in both the wizarding and Muggle financial worlds, several significant historical artifacts, and a library that Sharpfang described with a flicker of what might, in a goblin, have been genuine respect. What she had not fully known, what even her father's documents had only hinted at, was the extent of Albus Dumbledore's involvement. Dumbledore was named executor of the Potter estate in a will signed by James and Lily Potter in September of 1981, Sharpfang said. 6 weeks before their deaths. 6 weeks, Petunia said. Her pen didn't pause. The will also named Sirius Black as Harry Potter's godfather and intended guardian, with full guardianship rights in the event of the parents' deaths. Sharpfang paused. Sirius Black was imprisoned without trial on the 2nd of November 1981. Petunia's pen paused. Without trial, she said. Correct. Under emergency wartime powers authorized by the then Minister for Magic, Millicent Bagnold, which powers were in practice administered through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, where the relevant officials were at that time broadly sympathetic to recommendations from Albus Dumbledore. Another pause. We make no formal allegation. We state facts as they appear in records. Of course, Petunia said, and began writing again. With Black imprisoned and the will contested on grounds that Black was a convicted Death Eater, the conviction being itself the product of the untried imprisonment, the guardianship provisions of the will became legally void under Wizarding Family Law Article 33. Harry Potter became, in legal terms, a ward without a designated guardian. And Dumbledore, as executor, took guardianship. Dumbledore did not take formal guardianship. He placed the child with you. Sharpfang's tone was absolutely neutral. In doing so, he also placed the child outside the formal jurisdiction of the Wisengamot's wardship oversight, since you are a Muggle-adjacent individual and Harry Potter was placed in a Muggle residence. This removed the normal Wisengamot review processes that apply to orphaned magical children. He made Harry legally invisible, Petunia said. That is one way to characterize it. Sharpfang turned a page. In your absence as formal guardian, you were not recognized as guardian in any wizarding legal instrument. Mrs. Dursley, Dumbledore, as executor, has had full authority over the Potter estate since November 1981. What has he done with that authority? Sharpfang laid 3 pages of close-printed figures on the desk. The summary was this: Dumbledore had not stolen from the Potter estate in any direct or obvious sense. He was far too careful for that, and in any case far too wealthy himself to need to. What he had done was restructure it. The main Potter vault remained intact and was in fact growing, invested wisely and largely untouched. But several secondary instruments, trust funds, property titles, specific bequests outlined in the will, had been quietly adjusted. Educational funds that the will directed should be available to Harry's designated guardian had been redirected into a general Hogwarts charitable trust. A specific bequest from Fleamont Potter to his grandchild, involving a set of properties in Wales and Scotland, had been placed in administrative suspension pending clarification of guardianship status, a suspension that had, 5 years later, not been clarified. And a private letter vault, sealed correspondence left specifically for Harry by both James and Lily, to be opened on his 11th birthday, had been flagged in Dumbledore's records with a notation in his own handwriting: discretion required contents prior to delivery. Petunia stopped writing. She looked at that last item for a long time. Discretion required contents, she said. He was going to read the letters before giving them to Harry. There is no indication he has yet accessed the letter vault, Sharpfang said. The notation appears to be forward planning. Planning to edit what Harry's parents told him. She said it very quietly. Planning to decide which pieces of his parents Harry was allowed to have. The room was silent except for the cool white light from the false window and the distant, deep sounds of the bank around them. Mrs. Dursley, Sharpfang said. Gringotts does not involve itself in the political affairs of the wizarding world. However. A pause, and Petunia had the sense that the pause was loaded in the way a goblin pause rarely was. Gringotts does have an interest in accurate and lawful administration of accounts. We also have an interest in legal guardianship being correctly established, since an incorrectly established guardianship creates liability in account administration. Were you to formalize your guardianship through the appropriate wizarding legal channels, we would be in a position to provide you with considerably more comprehensive access to these records. And remove Dumbledore's executor authority? Establish a competing authority, which under Article 33b would require a Wisengamot hearing to adjudicate. Given the circumstances surrounding Sirius Black's imprisonment, we believe there are grounds that would be, another pause, of interest to an independent review. Petunia looked at Sharpfang. You want Sirius Black's case reviewed? Gringotts wants accurate legal records, Sharpfang said. The current inaccuracies are creating administrative difficulties. She almost smiled. What would I need to file? Sharpfang produced another document, already prepared, which told her a great deal about how long the goblins had been waiting for someone to come through that door and ask exactly these questions. She walked out of Gringotts 2.5 hours after she'd walked in, with a leather satchel of copied documents, a letter of formal engagement with Gringotts as her account liaison, and the name of a wizarding solicitor, a small, somewhat eccentric firm in Knockturn Alley that was not, she had been carefully assured, connected to any of Dumbledore's significant professional relationships. She walked back through Diagon Alley feeling, for the first time since November, like she was moving forward rather than standing still. She did not go directly home. She turned left at the end of the alley and found the small, easily missed tea shop that she'd been told about through the network, tucked between a cauldron repair shop and an apothecary. Inside, 4 people were already waiting, 2 women and 2 men, ranging in age from late 20s to early 60s, all with the particular quality of people who had learned to make themselves easy to overlook. The Squib network did not have a name. Names created records and records could be found. It had people, and a system of contact, and a rotating series of meeting points that changed quarterly. Petunia had been an observer member since she was 19. She had never called a meeting before. She sat down, ordered tea, looked at the 4 people around the table, and said, "I need researchers." They looked at her. "I have a project," she said. "Long term. 5, maybe 6 years before the first phase becomes active. I need people who can access records, ministry archives, Old Prophet issues, Hogwarts history, St. Mungo's files if possible. I need people who can move quietly and don't have existing loyalties to Dumbledore's faction." "What's the project?" The older woman, Marjorie, who had been a squib in a family of ministry officials for 30 years and who knew where a great many things were kept, asked. "Documentation," Petunia said. "Everything there is to know about how Albus Dumbledore has operated over the past 40 years. Decisions he's made. People he's influenced. Cases he's been adjacent to where things went conveniently his way. The complete picture, with sources." She picked up her tea. "I'm not planning to fabricate anything. I don't need to. I just need everything that actually happened, organized and verified." The silence around the table had a particular quality to it, not surprise, exactly. More like the sound of several people recognizing something they'd been waiting to hear for a long time. "That's a significant undertaking," said David, who was 31 and had a squib-born father and a mother who worked in the Hall of Records at the ministry. "He has a lot of people who'd notice people looking." "I know," Petunia said. "That's why we go slowly." "What's the end goal?" Marjorie asked. "A child who knows the truth," Petunia said. "And eventually, a public who does too." Another silence. Then Marjorie nodded, once. "I've been collecting on Dumbledore since 1960, she said. "I'll share my files. I can get into the ministry record room on Tuesdays," David said. One by one, the others nodded. Petunia drank her tea and wrote down names and contact schedules, and thought about Harry at home with Vernon, probably currently expressing strong opinions about his afternoon nap, and felt the pieces of a very large and complicated thing beginning to find their proper places. 5 years passed. Not quietly, nothing with small children was quiet, but productively. Harry at 2 was an extremely curious person who approached the world as though it had been put there specifically to answer questions he was generating faster than anyone could address. He said his first clear word at 11 months, that, pointing at a book Petunia was reading. By 18 months he had 6 words and a method of indicating questions, a particular furrow between his brows and an outstretched finger, that made Vernon laugh every time even as he scrambled to explain things clearly. They did not talk down to him. This was Petunia's first principle, established before he could talk and maintained without exception throughout. Harry was always told the truth at whatever level of complexity he could currently handle, and the level he could handle was consistently higher than expected. Numbers first, Petunia told Vernon when Harry was 2.5. Then reading. They go together. Most kids don't start reading until, Harry isn't most kids, and it's not about being exceptional, it's about giving him tools. Vernon was quiet for a moment. Then, right. What do we use? She'd prepared materials. She had been preparing materials for 2.5 years, drawing on both the educational resources she understood from the Muggle world and the texts she'd been able to acquire through the network, wizarding educational theory that was, in many ways, far more advanced than its Muggle counterpart because it had to account for children who might accidentally levitate their dinner when frustrated. The combination was, she thought, rather good. Harry by 3 could count to 100 and recognized most letters. By 4 he was reading simple books and had opinions about which ones were good and which ones were boring. Aunt Petunia, nothing happens. By 5 he was reading at a level that made his nursery school teacher ask Petunia, with mild concern, whether they were perhaps pushing him too hard. No, Petunia said, pleasantly. The teacher made a note and didn't push further. At home, alongside the reading and the maths, there were other lessons. Not secret, Petunia had no interest in making things seem furtive or forbidden, which she knew from painful experience was the surest way to make a child fixate on them. The other lessons were just part of life at number 4, as ordinary as breakfast. When Harry was 3, Petunia showed him the copper-electric sensation. Not showed him, exactly, she couldn't produce it on demand, and if she could it wouldn't have been visible. But she described it to him, in simple terms, that there was a world that worked differently from the visible one, that she could feel it the way you could sometimes feel weather before the rain came, and that his parents had been a part of it, and that he was going to be a part of it too, one day. "Can I feel it?" Harry asked. He was sitting on the kitchen floor eating an apple and looking at her with those green eyes that always made her breath catch slightly, because they were Lily's, and that was still an ongoing adjustment. "Probably," Petunia said. "When you're a bit older it'll come on its own." "What does it feel like?" She thought about it. "Like when you're near something very important," she said. "Like the air before a thunderstorm. Like something is about to happen." Harry considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. "Is it good?" "It can be both," she said honestly. "Like most important things." When he was 4, she started telling him about his parents. Not the mythology, not the boy who lived story, which she'd encountered in the books sold in Diagon Alley's bookshop and which made her teeth ache with its shining convenient narrative, the brave parents, the loving sacrifice, the miraculous survival. She told him about Lily. About who Lily had actually been, stubborn and bright and funny and occasionally infuriating in the way of people who are always slightly more right than you want them to be. She told him about how Lily had laughed, and what she'd been like at 10, and the fact that she'd been terrified of spiders but too proud to admit it and would instead affect a sort of elaborate indifference around them that convinced absolutely no one. She told him about James, too, from Lily's letters, the patchy portrait she could construct from second-hand accounts, but as honest as she could make it. Brave and loyal and slightly reckless. Good in a crisis. Fiercely protective of people he loved. Harry listened to all of it with the focused attention he gave things that mattered. "They died because of a war?" he asked, when he was 4.5. He'd heard this part in fragments and this was the first time he was asking it directly. "Yes," Petunia said. "Who started the war?" "A wizard called Voldemort started the fighting. But wars have deeper beginnings than the first shot. This one had been building for a long time." "Did you know them?" "My mum and dad." "Your mum was my sister." She kept her voice steady. "I knew her very well for a long time, and then the war made things complicated, the way wars do. I didn't know your father as well. But from everything Lily told me, he was a good man." Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you sad that she died?" "Yes," Petunia said. "Every day." "Me too," Harry said, with a matter-of-fact solemnity that broke and reset something in her chest simultaneously. "I think. I don't really remember her. But I think I'm sad anyway." "That's right," she said. "That makes sense." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the logic of this, and went back to his book. When he was 5, she started talking about Dumbledore. She was careful here, not because she wanted to soften the picture, but because she understood the difference between giving a child information and giving them a grievance. Grievances made for reactive people. She wanted Harry to be analytical, not angry. Anger could be part of it, later, when he was old enough to direct it usefully. For now, facts. "There's a man named Albus Dumbledore," she said one evening, Harry sitting at the kitchen table doing arithmetic while she made dinner. "He's very famous and very powerful in the wizarding world. When you go to the magical school, Hogwarts, he'll be the headmaster." Harry looked up from his arithmetic. "Is he a good man?" "He believes he is," Petunia said. "Most people believe he is. He has done genuinely good things in his life. He defeated a very powerful dark wizard a long time ago, and he has spent a great deal of his career working against dark magic." "But?" She looked at him. 5 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, watching her with the particular focused intensity that she had come to think of as simply being Harry's face when he was paying attention. But he has also made choices, she said carefully, that hurt people. That were convenient for him and harmful for others. And he has been very careful to make sure that most people never knew about those choices. What kind of choices? We'll get to the specifics when you're older. But the important thing to understand now is this. She set down the wooden spoon and turned to face him properly. When people are very powerful and very respected, there's a temptation, not just for them, but for everyone around them, to believe that they must be doing the right thing. That someone so brilliant and so good couldn't possibly be making harmful decisions. That's a trap. Reputation is not the same as character. Harry considered this. So just because everyone thinks he's good, doesn't make it true. You look at what people do, not what people say about them. You look at the consequences of their choices. You follow the facts. How do I get the facts? Research, she said. Records. Documents. The same way you'd find out anything true about anything. She turned back to the stove. You're good at research. You've been good at it since you could read. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Aunt Petunia. Did Dumbledore have something to do with my parents dying? She was careful. I believe he could have prevented it and chose not to, she said. I think the situation was more useful to him with them as martyrs than as survivors. The silence was different from his usual thinking silences. Heavier. Okay, Harry said, eventually. Okay? I mean, he looked at his arithmetic paper for a moment, then back up at her. His jaw had the same set it always did when he'd made a decision about something. I need to know everything. All of it. Whatever you have. When you're old enough to use it properly, she said. I'm pretty old, he said, and he was 5, so she felt the smile come before she could stop it. Yes, she said. You're getting there. The day before Harry's 6th birthday, a letter arrived. Not the Hogwarts letter, that was still 5 years away. This was from Sharpfang, via the network's secure post system, a brief note confirming that the first phase of the legal proceedings she'd initiated, the formal petition for guardianship recognition, had cleared the preliminary review stage. The case would go before a sealed Wiesengemot hearing in 3 months. Sharpfang recommended she attend, and suggested she might find it useful to bring the documentation regarding Sirius Black's imprisonment to the attention of the junior advocate assigned to the case. Also enclosed, a copy of a motion, filed simultaneously, for an independent review of the administration of the Potter estate. And a note, in Sharpfang's precise handwriting, at the bottom: we have become aware that the headmaster of Hogwarts submitted an inquiry to this bank last month requesting information on whether any access to the Potter estate accounts had been requested by outside parties. We decline to answer on the grounds of client confidentiality. You should be aware that he is watching. Petunia read this note at the kitchen table while Harry ate his birthday eve supper. She always made his favorite the night before his birthday, a tradition she'd started when he was 2 without quite deciding to start it, and then folded it carefully and placed it in the satchel that lived in the locked bottom drawer of her desk. Is it important? Harry asked, not looking up from his spaghetti, because he had an uncanny ability to notice when she was paying attention to correspondence. Somewhat, she said. Good important or problem important? Both, she said. Which is usually how the interesting things go. Harry considered this, ate a length of spaghetti in a manner that Vernon had been trying to correct for 3 years without success, and nodded with the gravity of someone storing the information for later use. Tell me about Gringotts, he said. So she did. It was not the first time she'd mentioned it. She'd been building this picture piece by piece for over a year, the broad outlines of the financial and legal landscape he'd be navigating, but tonight she went into more detail. She told him about goblins, about how the bank worked, about what the Potter estate consisted of and why it mattered. She told him about account access and legal guardianship and the specific ways in which the financial record of an institution like Gringotts was more honest and more durable than almost any other kind of record, because goblins kept everything and discarded nothing. Harry listened to all of it. His eyes had that quality they got when he was building a model of something in his head, mapping relationships and positions, understanding structure. When she finished, he said, "So the money is safe, but Dumbledore has been managing it." "Legally, yes, as executor. And we're changing that. We're in the process of changing that." He chewed thoughtfully. "He'll notice." "He already has," she said, and tapped the satchel. Harry looked at the satchel, and then at her, with an expression that was 5 going on 40. "Are we going to be okay?" Petunia looked at her nephew, this small, extraordinary, utterly unnerving child that her sister had somehow produced and that she'd been given the privilege and the terror of raising for 5 years, and felt the answer settle in her the way true things settled, not as certainty exactly, but as commitment. "We're going to be better than okay," she said. "We're going to be prepared." Harry seemed to find this sufficient. He went back to his spaghetti. Outside, the summer evening was doing its warm suburban thing, lawnmowers and distant radios and the small sounds of Privet Drive being exactly what it was. The copper-electric feeling that lived at the base of Petunia's awareness hummed gently, Harry's magic, strengthening year by year, recognizable to her now as distinctly his in the way she could recognize his voice from another room. "Not one of us," Dumbledore had told her. She watched Harry eat his birthday Eve spaghetti and thought that she had been of them every single day of her life, in the only way that had ever actually mattered. She had understood them, and watched them, and learned from the margins what the center refused to see. And now she had a nephew who was going to walk into that world with his eyes completely open. She thought that Dumbledore had made, over the course of his long and brilliant career, many careful and strategic mistakes. She thought the one he'd made on her doorstep in November 1981 was going to cost him the most. Chapter 3, The Boy Who Chose the Hogwarts Letter arrived on a Tuesday. Harry was 11 years old, eating toast, and reading a bound copy of Wizarding Britain, Financial Histories 1900 to 1980 that Sharpfong had sent as a birthday gift because Sharpfong had, over the course of 5 years of correspondence and 3 in-person meetings, developed what Petunia considered a goblin's version of affection for her nephew. The owl landed on the kitchen windowsill, dropped the envelope on the table with the casual authority of something that had never once doubted its welcome, and helped itself to Harry's toast. Harry looked at the envelope. He looked at the owl. He looked at Petunia. "Finally," he said. "You've known it was coming for 6 years," she said. "Knowing it's coming and it actually arriving are different things." He picked up the envelope and examined the Hogwarts seal with the focused attention he gave anything he hadn't physically held before. Then he opened it, read it once quickly and once slowly, set it down. September 1st. King's Cross, Platform 9 3/4. A pause. "They don't explain how to get to the platform." "No," Petunia agreed. "They never do. It's not an oversight." Harry filed this information. "Testing to see if you know already. Or to see who you ask. Usually the latter. So if I just turn up knowing, they'll notice. Some of them will." She poured more tea. "That may not be a problem depending on who you want to notice what." Harry picked up the letter again and read the supply list. His expression was the one she privately called his architecture face, the one where he was mapping the structure of something, seeing how the pieces fit together. He'd had it since he was about 4. It was disconcertingly like Lily's face when she was working through a charms problem. "Ollivanders," he said. "For the wand." "Yes." "Does the wand choose the wizard thing? Is that actually true or is it a story they tell to make wand buying feel significant?" "It's actually true," Petunia said. "Or true enough. The precise mechanics are more complicated and contested, but the essential premise holds." He nodded. "And Gringotts, for the vault. I've already been in contact with Sharpfong. Everything is arranged. When do we go?" "Saturday." He went back to his toast, which the owl had significantly depleted, and read the financial history with one hand and the supply list with the other, and Petunia sat across from him and drank her tea and thought about all the ways this was going to go differently from how it was supposed to go. The file from the Wisengamot hearing was 4 inches thick and lived in the locked drawer with everything else. The hearing, 3 months after Sharpfang's letter, had gone considerably better than Petunia had allowed herself to expect, partly because the goblin-appointed advocate was exceptionally good and partly because the evidence, when laid out in order, had a cumulative weight that was difficult to argue around. The guardianship had been formalized. The estate review was ongoing. The case regarding Sirius Black's imprisonment had been flagged as requiring further investigation, which was not exoneration and not freedom but was the first official crack in a story that had been settled fact for 10 years. Dumbledore had appeared at the hearing. She'd known he would. He'd appeared in his most magnificent mode, the whole grandeur of him, the silver beard and the half-moon glasses and the robes that somehow suggested ancient wisdom without trying, and made the case, with quiet gravity, that the current arrangements for Harry's welfare were working well and that disruption to established wards and protections could put the child at risk. Petunia had stood up and said, in the same quiet voice she used for everything important, "The headmaster is conflating the blood ward enchantments, which are bound to me as a blood relation and will remain intact regardless of guardianship status, with legal custodial arrangements, which are entirely separate. I would ask the Wisengamot to consult with Gringotts on this point, since they have the relevant documents." They had consulted with Gringotts. Dumbledore had looked at her across the Wisengamot chamber with an expression she wouldn't forget, not anger, not exactly, more like the focused attention of someone recalibrating a calculation they thought they'd already completed. He'd looked at her the way he'd looked at Lily sometimes, from the fragments Lily had described, like something had surprised him, which almost never happened, and he was deciding what to do about it. She'd met his eyes and smiled, pleasantly, and he'd inclined his head the smallest fraction. It was the beginning of the most interesting chess game she'd ever played. He'd sent a letter the following week. Warm, gracious, the kind of letter that could have been written by someone's beloved grandfather. He suggested that they had, perhaps, gotten off on the wrong foot. He said he hoped they could discuss Harry's future together. He said that Harry would always be safe so long as he remained under the headmaster's guidance, and that this had been Lily's dearest wish. Petunia had written back, equally warmly, thanking him for his letter, noting that she looked forward to a productive relationship, and saying nothing, absolutely nothing, that committed her to anything. She'd shown Harry the exchange when he was 9. He'd read both letters carefully and then looked at her. "He's trying to find out how much you know," Harry said. "Yes. And you're not telling him?" "Not yet." She put the letters back in the file. "Right now the most useful thing is for him to be uncertain. He can't plan around something he doesn't understand." Harry had thought about this. When do we stop being uncertain at him? When you're in a position where the information does more damage in public than it does as a private card, she said. When you have enough of it that releasing some doesn't deplete the whole supply. Like money, he said. You don't spend until you know the exchange rate. Exactly like that. He'd gone back to his homework, and Petunia had thought, not for the first time, that having a child who immediately understood strategic patience was either very fortunate or slightly alarming, and had decided it was both. Saturday arrived with good weather, which felt appropriate. Vernon drove them to the leaky cauldron and squeezed Harry's shoulder before they got out of the car. Be extraordinary, he said, which was his version of a long speech about pride and love and how much Harry had come to mean to him. Harry squeezed back. I'll settle for prepared. Same thing, Vernon said, which was not entirely true but was entirely Vernon. Petunia tapped the bricks. She'd had the brass-tipped umbrella in her hand since they left the car, force of habit, and Diagon Alley opened. She watched Harry step through and take it in. She'd deliberately not brought him before. Not because she wanted it to be overwhelming, she had no interest in orchestrating his first encounter with his world for maximum emotional impact, that was Dumbledore's approach, but because she'd wanted him to arrive with context rather than sensation. She'd described Diagon Alley to him in some detail. He had, accordingly, a map in his head before he had eyes on it. He looked around with interest rather than awe. His gaze moved methodically: architecture, people, shop signage, the quality of the crowd. He catalogued. He was Harry, and cataloging was how he engaged with new things. "Gringotts first," he said. "Of course." They walked up the alley and Petunia noted the heads turning. Harry noticed them too. She could tell from the slight adjustment in his posture, not discomfort, just awareness. By the time they were halfway up the alley there was a murmur running ahead of them, people straightening and leaning and whispering, because Harry Potter was recognizably his father's son and had been famous since he was 15 months old, and Diagon Alley had very good social radar. Harry walked through it like he walked through most things, at a steady pace, without performing or deflecting, simply present. At the steps of Gringotts, a goblin was waiting. Not the door guard, one specifically waiting, which told Harry something immediately because Petunia saw him notice it. "Mr. Potter," the goblin said. "Grip Hook. Sharpfang sends regards. The senior account meeting is scheduled before the vault visit, if you're ready." "I'm ready," Harry said. He glanced at Petunia. She gave him the small nod that meant "I'm here, go ahead." The meeting with Sharpfang was 30 minutes. Petunia had prepared Harry for its broad contents, the estate overview, the key documents, the current legal status, but she deliberately left some things for him to encounter fresh, because there was a difference between knowing intellectually that something existed and meeting it for the first time in a room, and she'd wanted to see how he handled the difference. She watched him receive the full picture: the estate, the properties, the letter vault, the serious black situation, the notation in Dumbledore's records about discretion required. He sat across from Sharpfang in the same chair she'd sat in a decade ago and took notes in his small precise handwriting. He'd inherited her handwriting, or developed it independently, she'd never been sure, and asked sharp, exact questions. He asked about Sirius Black. He asked about the current status of the investigation. He asked what accessing the letter vault would require and what timelines applied. He asked, which she hadn't specifically prepared him to ask, whether Gringotts had records of any other children whose guardianship arrangements had been made through Dumbledore rather than through normal Wisengamot channels. Sharpfang looked at him for a moment with that assessing, calibrating attention. "There are 2 other cases of interest," Sharpfang said. "We are not at liberty to share details without the parties' involvement. However, you may find it worth noting that there is a Neville Longbottom currently being raised by his grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, under a guardianship arrangement that bypassed several normal procedures in 1981. Harry made a note. When they came out of the meeting and rode down to the vault, Griphook driving with the particular goblin enjoyment of high-speed underground cart travel, Harry was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was thinking fast. In the vault, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of the Potter family in gold and artifacts and stacked enchanted containers that she'd never opened because they hadn't been hers to open, Harry stood for a moment and looked at it. Not with greed or even particular pleasure. With the same architectural assessment he turned on everything. "It's a lot," he said. "Yes. He left all of this here and put me with you and Vernon in Privet Drive." "Yes." Harry picked up a single galleon and turned it in his fingers. "He really didn't think you'd ever look, did he?" "No," she said. "He thought I was exactly what he made me. A marginalized woman with a grudge and no access. He underestimated you completely." "Most people do," she said. "I've found it useful." Harry set the galleon down. He turned to face her in the vault with the gold gleaming behind him, and he had the look he sometimes had, the one she only ever saw in private, that was somehow both younger and older than his face, the one that meant something genuine was happening under the architecture. "Aunt Petunia," he said. "Thank you. For all of it. Everything you did. The hearings and the research and the—" he stopped. "You didn't have to do any of it. You didn't have to take me. Harry, I know you love me," he said, with the directness of a child who had been told true things his whole life and expected to receive them. "I know that's why. I just want you to know that I know everything it cost you. Not just money. Everything. She looked at him in the vault light, this boy with Lily's eyes and James's hair and something else entirely that was just him, built from the past decade in her house with her lessons and her tea and her very particular brand of love. It didn't cost me, she said. It returned to me more than you can possibly know. He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the vault. Right. What am I allowed to take today? Spending money for school, she said. The rest stays until we've completed the estate review and the full legal picture is settled. Practical, he said, and filled a bag with the efficient economy of someone who has had the value and meaning of money explained to them carefully over several years. They went to Madame Malkin's, where Harry was fitted for robes without incident except that a blonde boy was already there being fitted at the other end, and the blonde boy glanced over and registered Harry's presence with the rapid calculation of someone who had been raised to know exactly who was important in a room. Hogwarts, the boy said. Yes, Harry said. First year? Yes. The blonde boy assessed him for another moment. He had the manner of someone very confident of his social position and accustomed to that confidence being confirmed quickly. Draco Malfoy. Harry looked at him for a moment. Harry Potter. The reaction was the one Harry got everywhere, a small flicker, eyes going briefly wide, but Draco recovered faster than most and tilted his head with a new quality of interest. I've heard about you, he said. Most people have, Harry said pleasantly. It's mostly incorrect. Draco's eyes narrowed fractionally. You're not, I expected, something different. Harry said. I know. He held his arms out for the measuring tape. What family are you from? This was exactly the right question, Petunia noted from her chair by the door. Harry had done his social reading on wizarding families and he knew that asking a pureblood about their family was both polite and efficient. It told you everything about their politics, their alliances, their sense of their own place in the world, in about 4 sentences. Draco explained his family, the Malfoys, the Blacks, the connections, the positions. He did it in the practiced way of someone who had recited this genealogy many times, but there was also a genuine pride in it that wasn't entirely unpleasant. When he finished he looked at Harry expectantly. My mother was Lily Evans, Harry said. Muggle-born. My father was James Potter. Old pureblood family, quite a significant one actually in terms of the historical record. I've been reading the financial histories. He paused. I mention the Muggle-born part first because it's the most interesting part, not the least interesting. Draco processed this in silence for a moment. Your father's family goes back to the Peverils, he said, which was a calculated response, acknowledging the pure-blood credentials while sidestepping the Muggle-born comment. So does the Malfoy line, distantly, Harry said. I read that too. Another small recalibration from Draco. He was smart, Petunia thought, smarter than his confidence initially suggested. He was used to setting the social terms in a room and Harry had quietly taken the pen from him and neither of them had quite announced it was happening. They finished being fitted. At the door, Draco looked at Harry with an expression that was something between wariness and intrigued. There'll be groups at Hogwarts, he said. It wasn't a warning exactly. More an offering. People you'll want to be seen with. I'll want to be seen with the people worth seeing, Harry said. I'll figure out who those are when I meet them. Draco seemed to find this more interesting than dismissive. He nodded, once, and left. Petunia watched him go. He'll be useful or he'll be a problem, she said. He'll be both, I expect, Harry said. Most intelligent people are. Ollivanders was last. Garrick Ollivander was one of those people who existed at their own particular frequency. The shop was dim and wandering and smelled of sawdust and something older and stranger, and Ollivander himself came from between shelves like something that had been waiting specifically for them. His eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that was not rude so much as total. Harry Potter, he said. I expected you eventually. Those pale eyes moved to Petunia. Stayed there. And you? I know who you are. You know what I am, she said. Squib born, he said. Petunia Evans. Yes. Your father came here once, years ago, with both daughters. I remember every customer. He tapped his temple. Lily was 12, I think. Spectacular wand match. Holly and phoenix feather. Supple. His eyes came back to Harry. And you? The process took longer than she'd expected and shorter than she'd feared. Ollivander moved through boxes with purpose, testing 3 that did nothing, 2 that produced small disasters, and 1 that lit the shop in warm gold before he switched it for the next one, shaking his head with the dissatisfaction of an artist who knows what he's looking for. Then he reached for a box that was slightly older than the others, slightly less pristine, set it on the counter and opened it. Curious, he said, in a tone that suggested it wasn't curious at all. Very curious. Holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, nice and supple. He held it out. Try this. Harry took the wand. The warmth that filled the shop was different from the previous gold light, quieter, more complex, like the light that comes through water rather than from a source. Harry stood very still with the wand in his hand and felt it, whatever it was, and Petunia watched his face and felt the copper-electric sensation ring through her like a bell struck clearly. Curious, Ollivander said again. The phoenix whose tail feather lives in your wand gave only 1 other feather. 1 other wand. It is curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar. Harry looked at the wand in his hand. Looked at Ollivander. Voldemort's wand. The very same. We must expect great things from you, Mr. Potter. Harry set the wand down on the counter with a small deliberate movement, looked at Ollivander, and said, I prefer to be expected to do specific things, if it's all the same to you. Great things is a bit vague. Ollivander looked at him with those silver eyes, and something happened in his expression, a small shift, a recalibration. Then he laughed, softly, which seemed to be something he didn't do very often. 7 galleons, he said. They were nearly back to the car, the afternoon turning golden around Diagon Alley, the crowds thickening, the low hum of the wizarding world doing its busy afternoon thing, when the boy found them. He was Harry's age, perhaps slightly smaller, with a round face and an expression of someone who had been mildly anxious for so long it had become his resting state. He was carrying a list that looked like Petunia's supply list but more crumpled, and he was looking around with the quiet desperation of someone who had lost track of something important. Sorry, he said, when he nearly walked into Harry. I'm sorry, I'm looking for, there's a toad, I had it and now, brown? Harry said. Mid-sized? Heading toward the apothecary with notable conviction? The boy blinked. Yes. How did you, saw it 2 minutes ago? Harry pointed. It turned left at the cauldron shop. It'll be near the back entrance, the smell pulls them in apparently, something in the ingredient storage. The boy stared at him. How do you know that? I read about magical toads before coming, Harry said simply. They're attracted to specific compound ingredient smells. I wanted to know the area. He paused. Do you want help finding it? 10 minutes later they had retrieved the toad from behind a barrel of dried bicorn horn, which was exactly where Harry had predicted, and the boy was holding it with the relieved expression of someone whose anxiety has temporarily resolved. I'm Neville, he said. Neville Longbottom. Something in Harry's posture, very slight, something only Petunia would have caught, registered the name. Harry Potter. Neville blinked. The same flicker as Draco, but where Draco had recalibrated and projected confidence, Neville's face did something more genuine, a mix of awe and something that looked oddly like recognition. Oh, he said. I thought, my Gran mentioned, he stopped. Your Gran mentioned me? Harry said. She said you'd probably be at Hogwarts, Neville said. She said, he stopped again, seeming to remember he was saying this to a stranger. Sorry. I don't know why I said that. Harry looked at him with the focused attention he gave things he found genuinely interesting. Longbottom, he said. Your parents were Alice and Frank Longbottom. Neville's face went careful. Yes. Horrors. They were, Harry paused, choosing. They were hurt during the war. Yes. Careful and quiet. I'm sorry, Harry said. I know what it's like to have parents you can't have. Neville looked at him, not with pity recognition, the kind that Harry had learned to deflect as part of the boy who lived mythology, but with a genuine unguarded thing, the kind that happened when two people discover an unexpected shared territory. Right, Neville said. Yes. I suppose you do. They talked for another 20 minutes, standing in the alley with the toad in Neville's arms going through what appeared to be mild existential consternation about being caught. Neville was nervous and self-deprecating and funny in the dry, accidental way of people who don't entirely know they're being funny. Harry was direct and genuine, asking questions that weren't small talk, and Neville seemed to find this disarming in the best possible way, like someone had removed the requirement to perform and he wasn't sure what to do with the freedom but was beginning to enjoy it. When they parted, Neville back toward his grandmother at Flourish and Blots, Harry and Petunia back toward the leaky cauldron. Harry walked for half a minute in silence and then said, his parents' situation and the circumstances around it are similar to mine. Yes, Petunia said. Dumbledore is adjacent to that too, isn't he? Sharpfang mentioned his guardianship arrangement bypassed normal procedures. Yes. He'll be a good ally, Harry said. He'll be a good friend, Petunia said. Those are more valuable. Harry thought about this. Can they be both? If you're lucky, yes. Harry nodded. They came out through the leaky cauldron and Vernon was parked at the end of the road, reading a motoring magazine with the patient composure of a man who has accepted he will spend a significant portion of his life waiting for things he doesn't entirely understand. He rolled down the window when he saw them. How'd it go? I have a wand, Harry said, getting in. It's the brother of Voldemort's wand and apparently that means great things, but I told Ollivander I'd prefer specifics. Vernon looked at Petunia. It went very well, Petunia said. The 1st of September arrived on a clear morning with the quality of light that belonged to the specific kind of autumn that hadn't decided yet whether to be warm. King's Cross was its usual organized chaos. They moved through it efficiently. Petunia had brought the trolley because the trunk was heavy and she was practical, and found the barrier between 9 and 10. She had explained the platform to Harry months ago, when they'd started Hogwarts preparation in earnest. She had also explained, very clearly, the dynamics he was about to walk into, the proportions of the student body, the house system and its social implications, the particular landscape of celebrity that awaited him on that platform and in that first train journey. There will be people who want to be near you because of the scar, she said, at the barrier. Around them, the early crowd of the station moved. There will be people who want to test you because of the name. There will be people who are afraid of you for reasons they can't quite articulate and will translate that into hostility. She met his eyes. None of that is about you. Know the difference. I know, he said. And Dumbledore will be watching you from the moment you arrive. He'll have his picture of you already, the grateful orphan, the modest hero, the child who doesn't quite know what he is. When you don't match it, he'll get curious, Harry said. And then careful. Yes. She straightened his collar, which she knew was unnecessary and did anyway because she was his aunt and he was going away for 9 months and some gestures existed outside strategy. Be kind where you can. It's not weakness. I know that too, he said, and he did, she'd made sure of it. She hugged him. He hugged back, hard, in the way he'd hugged since he was 3, entirely committed, no reservation, the way someone hugs who has been told their whole life that they are genuinely loved. Right, she said. Every week, he said. If anything happens that concerns you, I'll write the same day. He pulled back, picked up the trolley, and looked at the barrier. Right. I'm going to go meet my world. It's already yours, she said. That's the first thing to remember. He gave her one last look, half grin, half that architectural assessment, and under both of them something quieter and more private that was just him, and walked through the barrier. On the train, Harry found Neville in the fourth compartment, being mild anxious company to a girl with a large amount of hair who was already reading a spell book with the focused intensity of someone for whom knowledge was a form of armor. Harry, Neville said, with visible relief. Neville. Harry put his trunk up, sat down, and looked at the girl. Hermione Granger, she said, without looking up. I've read about you. What did you think? Harry said. She looked up. Assessed him the way she assessed everything, for accuracy. The books about you are mostly primary sources that haven't been fact-checked, she said. The primary sources disagree on several key points, particularly regarding the events of October 31, 1981. I think what actually happened is probably much more complicated than any of the existing accounts. Harry looked at her for a long moment. I think, he said, you and I are going to get along very well. She looked faintly surprised, as though she'd expected argument rather than agreement, and then faintly pleased, as though agreement was something she didn't encounter as often as she deserved to. I expect so, she said, and went back to her book. The castle was extraordinary. Harry allowed himself that, walking up from the lake with the rest of the first years, the water black and mirror still, the castle rising against the sky in a way that was not like any building he'd seen, and feeling the copper-electric sensation surge strong and complex and various, the accumulated magic of 1,000 years in stone and mortar and the life that moved through it. He felt it the way Petunia had taught him to notice it, not as something external but as something he was part of, a current he was now joining. He noticed everything. The ghosts floating overhead. The portraits moving on the walls. The particular quality of the torchlight, warm and slightly gold. The smell of stone and beeswax and something complex and ancient underneath. He catalogued and he felt simultaneously, which was how Petunia had trained him, you could be analytical and present at the same time, and neither one diminished the other. Professor McGonagall was exactly as described in the historical documents he'd read, brisk, precise, expecting competence as the default. He respected her immediately. The great hall was a masterpiece. He noted the enchanted ceiling. Hermione muttered, it's not actually the sky, it's enchanted to look like it, I read about it in Hogwarts, a history, to Neville, who nodded with the expression of someone filing it away without particularly caring, and the 4 tables and the faculty table and, at the center of the faculty table, Albus Dumbledore. Harry looked at him. He was exactly as described and slightly more than he'd expected. Not in terms of power, he'd known about the power, had been prepared for the quality of presence the man carried. More in terms of the eyes. The photographs hadn't conveyed the eyes, very blue, very alert, very kind in the way that was either genuine warmth or the most sophisticated performance of warmth he'd ever seen. He sat at his table with the settled ease of a man completely certain of his place in a room. He was already looking at Harry. Their eyes met across the great hall for a single moment, the length of a breath, and Harry did not look away first, and something passed between them that was not readable as anything except the mutual recognition of two people who already know exactly who the other one is. Then the sorting began. The hat was placed on Harry's head last, tradition of the famous, he noted, always the dramatic finale, and the worn leather settled over his ears, and something happened that was like and not like having a conversation in a crowded room where both parties could hear each other perfectly. Well, said the hat. This is interesting. Is it? Harry thought back. I've sorted a great many students, the hat said, in the dry tone of something that has had approximately 1,000 years to develop opinions. I've rarely encountered a first year who came in with a briefing document. I prefer to know what I'm walking into. So I see. A pause, the sense of something going very deep and very wide, reading things he hadn't consciously offered. You're a great deal more than they're expecting. Several of them, actually. You'd know which ones I mean. Another pause. You could do anything, you know. Any house. I know, Harry thought. But Dumbledore expects Gryffindor. He's built everything around his expectations. Let him have this one, I'll choose the rest. The hat was quiet for a moment. Then, with what Harry could only describe as goblin-similar satisfaction, a deliberate choice. That's rare. Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table roared. Harry took the hat off and set it down and walked to the table and sat down between Neville, who had been sorted Gryffindor 3 students earlier and was looking cautiously thrilled, and a red-headed boy who introduced himself as Ron Weasley with the particular combination of awe and determined casualness that Harry had already learned to navigate. Across the hall, at the faculty table, Dumbledore was watching him with those blue eyes. Harry met the gaze, turned away, accepted Neville's extended hand, shook it, leaned back, and reached for the food that had appeared on the table. He was hungry. He'd had a busy day. And September had only just started, and there was a great deal of year ahead, and somewhere in this castle there was a corridor that he'd been reading about for 2 weeks, on a 3rd floor that everyone had been told explicitly to avoid. He thought, with a feeling that was somewhere between hunger and anticipation, let's see what you've hidden this time. Dumbledore rose to make his welcome speech, and Harry listened with one ear, eating roast chicken, already thinking 3 moves ahead. Chapter 4, The Architecture of a Lie. The 3rd floor corridor smelled like stone and something older, the specific quality of a place that had been warded recently, the magical equivalent of fresh paint over a wall with a complicated history. Harry noticed it the first time he walked past on his way to Charms, filed it, and didn't mention it to anyone for 2 weeks. He needed to understand it before he discussed it. The school itself he understood within the first fortnight, not fully. You couldn't fully understand a 1,000-year-old castle in 2 weeks, but the structural map of it, the social geography, the power dynamics, the information flows. He paid attention in every class, did the work better than required but not so ostentatiously that it became a thing, and spent the time he wasn't in class building the networks that mattered. Neville was the first and most important. Neville Longbottom was, underneath the anxiety and the self-deprecation, one of the more genuinely perceptive people Harry had encountered. He noticed things about people, small things, the kind that required actual attention to see, and he was almost pathologically honest in a way that made him an excellent counterweight to Harry's more strategic instincts. They studied together every evening and talked about everything, and within 3 weeks Harry knew that Neville's grandmother had told him very specific things about the war, and that Neville's version of certain events was subtly but significantly different from the official account. Gran says Dumbledore recommended Azkaban for the ones who attacked my parents, Neville said one evening, over Transfiguration homework. The Lestranges and the others. She says he pushed for the harshest sentences possible. That's probably true, Harry said. She didn't say it like it was a good thing, Neville said. She said it like he was covering something. Harry looked at him. Do you know what? No, Neville said. She won't say more than that. She gets a look, like the information is a door she decided not to open. Harry filed this alongside everything else. Hermione was the second essential. She was the best researcher he'd met outside of Petunia, which was a high standard, and she had the additional quality of being genuinely committed to accuracy over comfort. She had arrived at Hogwarts expecting to love it unreservedly and was in the process of discovering that loving something unreservedly and understanding it clearly were not the same exercise. She was 3 weeks into that discovery and finding it unpleasant and important simultaneously. The library is wonderful, she said, one afternoon in the first week, with the tone of someone delivering a qualified verdict. But there are entire sections that are selective. The historical record for anything involving Dumbledore after 1960 is either very complimentary or very absent. Selectively absent? Harry said. She frowned. The absences aren't random. They cluster around specific events and specific dates. She paused, seeming to process the implication of her own observation. That's not how libraries work if they've just not acquired certain texts. That's how libraries work if someone's made choices about acquisition. Harry let her sit with that. He's on the board of governors, Hermione said, more quietly. Has been since 1956, Harry said. She looked at him. How do you know that? I read the school's publicly available governance records before I arrived. She stared at him for a moment with an expression that kept recurring, the look of someone discovering that the landscape is different from the map they came with. Then she opened her notebook and made a note. Right, she said. What else have you read that I haven't? He gave her a list. She disappeared into it for a week and came back sharper-eyed and asking better questions. By October, they were three, Harry, Neville, Hermione, working the way good teams work, different strengths, honest disagreements, shared purpose. Neville had the emotional intelligence and the family knowledge, Hermione had the research capability and the rigorous logical framework, Harry had the strategic overview and 11 years of very specific preparation. What they were doing didn't have a name yet. They were just being curious together, which was the safest way to begin. The third-floor corridor kept pulling at him. He went the first time alone, on a Wednesday night in mid-October, under the invisibility cloak, one of the items from the Potter vault that he'd retrieved on a second Gringotts visit at the start of term. The cloak was extraordinary, the kind of magical object that older students spoke of in theoretical terms because most of them had never seen one. Harry wore it like a tool, which was what it was. The corridor was dark and heavily warded. He could feel the wards layered over each other, complex and deliberate, the magical equivalent of multiple locks on a single door. He moved slowly, reading them not with magic he could cast but with the copper-electric awareness he'd been trained since childhood to trust. Some wards he could feel were recent, first week of term, he estimated. Some were older, built into the fabric of the corridor itself. And at the far end, behind a locked door that he didn't try, something massive and warm and alive paced back and forth with a rhythm that thudded through the stone floor. Three-headed dog, he thought. He'd read about them. Three-headed dogs guarding something was a very specific magical security tradition, which meant whatever was under the trapdoor, he could feel the outline of it in the floor, the slight magical difference at the seam, was significant enough to require a creature that couldn't be bribed or stunned by most conventional magic. He went back to bed and in the morning looked up the history of Gringotts vault transfers. It took him 4 days to find it, not in the library, which as Hermione had noted had strategic absences, but in a supplementary research text Petunia had packed at the bottom of his trunk, a slim volume on wizarding financial events of the 20th century that the Hogwarts library definitely did not stock. A vault break-in at Gringotts, July 31st. The same day as Harry's birthday, which he noted as possibly meaningful or possibly coincidence, and he had been taught not to assume the former without evidence. Vault 713. Contents removed by Albus Dumbledore the same morning. He sat in the empty Charms classroom where he'd been reading and looked at that sentence for a long time. He told Hermione and Neville that evening. He laid it out the same way Petunia had always laid things out for him, facts first, inferences clearly labeled, questions marked as questions. Hermione listened and then immediately said, that could be coincidence. He might have removed it for entirely legitimate security reasons. He might have, Harry agreed. So let's find out what it is. How? Research, Harry said. What was valuable enough to keep in a Gringotts high-security vault but is now under a three-headed dog in a school? What does Dumbledore need to protect that he's moved from the most secure bank in Britain to the place he controls directly? Hermione's eyes went to the table, then back up. He doesn't trust Gringotts with it anymore. Or he wants it accessible, Neville said. They both looked at him. He shrugged slightly. Gran says that's always the question with powerful people, do they want something safe or do they want it close? Those aren't the same thing. That's very good, Hermione said, with the directness she applied to correct observations regardless of who made them. Gran's a smart woman, Neville said simply. The answer came from 3 directions simultaneously 2 weeks later. Hermione from the restricted section via a library slip she'd talked Professor Quirrell into signing, Harry from a text Petunia had marked in his reading list that had seemed abstract until now, and Neville from a conversation with his grandmother during the half-term owl that he'd reported back verbatim. The Philosopher's Stone. Nicholas Flamel. The Elixir of Life. They sat with it for a full evening without talking strategy, because some things needed to be absorbed before they could be used. It was Hermione who said it first. Voldemort is coming back. Dumbledore believes so, Harry said. Or he's preparing as if he does. Is there a difference? Yes, Harry said. If Voldemort is definitely coming back, then having the stone here is a last-ditch protective measure and Dumbledore is, whatever else, genuinely trying to prevent something catastrophic. He paused. If Dumbledore is preparing as if Voldemort is coming back, then he might be doing something else entirely. Like what? Neville asked. Like creating conditions that make certain things inevitable, Harry said. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happened when an uncomfortable idea arrived and nobody wanted to be the first to name it directly. It was Hermione again. You think he wants Voldemort to try for the stone? I think, Harry said carefully, that the stone's protections are not designed to stop Voldemort. They're designed to stop anyone who isn't a specific kind of person. He looked at them both. Whoever gets through those protections is going to be someone with a particular combination of skills, ethics, bravery and friendship. He's built a maze that filters for exactly the kind of person he's been selecting and shaping since they were children. A pause. He's built it for me. The fire in the common room crackled. Around them, other Gryffindors did homework and talked and moved through their evenings without any particular awareness that 3 11-year-olds by the window were revising the shape of the world they'd been handed. He wants you to go through it, Neville said. He wants me to go through it and get the stone and be proven as the hero who defeated Voldemort again, except this time I'd be old enough to remember it and to be grateful and to feel like I owed him something. Like the whole direction of my life was toward him and what he needs me to do. Harry looked at the fire. It would be a formative experience. Nothing bonds you to a mentor like surviving something impossible with their help. He'd position himself as the reason you survived, Hermione said slowly. He'd know you went down there, he'd probably allow it rather than actually stop you, and then he'd be waiting on the other side. The wise grandfather who knew what you'd do before you did it. Who believes in you. And after that, Harry said, I'd trust him. Another silence. So what do we do? Neville asked. We go through it, Harry said. But we don't do it alone, and we don't do it when he expects us to, and we don't pretend we don't know what it is when we get there. He'd written to Petunia the previous Sunday. The reply had come in 48 hours, fastest she'd ever responded, which told him she'd been half expecting some version of this. Her letter was 2 pages, precise and useful. The final line, whatever he's built down there, remember that traps are only effective on people who don't know they're in one. You know. That changes everything. He read that line 3 times. They went on the 14th of December, 2 weeks before the Christmas holidays, on a night when the castle had the particular quality of a place slightly emptied by pre-holiday distraction. Harry had the cloak and they shared it, which was a squeeze but manageable. The corridor was as he remembered, dark, warded, the sound of something massive and patient beyond the locked door. He used the cloakpin trick he'd worked out from reading about the door's locking mechanism, not magic, exactly, but a mechanical interaction with the magical lock that the network contact who'd taught it to his father had passed to Petunia who had passed it to him. The door opened. The 3-headed dog was awake. Music, Hermione said immediately. She'd prepared this, she'd read everything she could find on Cerberus-type creatures and their specific weaknesses and had brought a small music box for exactly this reason. She had it open before any of them finished processing the sight of 3 massive heads swinging toward them. The music box played and the dog's head swayed, and one by one the eyes went half-lidded. They moved fast, Harry and Neville and Hermione, and the trapdoor was open and they went through without any particular discussion about it because they were in motion and motion was the right call. They fell into Devil's Snare and Hermione cast Lumos Solum without hesitating, calm under pressure in the way of people who have rehearsed rather than people who are naturally fearless. There was a distinction Harry respected. Threw the winged keys, which he caught on the second pass on a broom he'd borrowed from the school supply because he hadn't brought his own, which later struck him as funny in a grim sort of way. Through the chess game, which Hermione solved in 7 moves with a clinical precision that made the enchanted pieces seem almost offended. The troll room was already dispatched, something had gotten there first, which Harry noted and filed. The fire room was Hermione's, the logic puzzle, and she solved it in 3 minutes. And then Harry went through the purple flames alone. He knew what he'd find. He'd known since he'd worked out the structure of it. The whole arrangement was a funnel, and funnels had a point. The final room was the point, and whatever was waiting there was the culmination, and going in knowing it was a designed experience was the most useful tool he had. The room was lit by wand light, and the thing he felt first was the mirror. It was tall and ornate and framed in a way that suggested significance, the Ariste inscription around the top, the gold frame, the quality of its magical signature enormous and complex and genuinely old. And standing in front of it, his back to Harry, was Professor Quirrell. Quirrell heard Harry enter and turned. He looked different in this room than in the classroom. The stammer was gone, which Harry had suspected since October, not because he'd worked it out definitively, but because the stammer had a quality of performance, of slightly too consistent, slightly too convenient, that his ear had flagged early. Without it, Quirrell's face had a different quality. Still frightened, actually, genuinely frightened, Harry thought, in the way of someone who has made a bargain they're now deeply uncertain about. Harry Potter, he said. Differently from how he said it in class. Professor Quirrell, Harry said. You know why I'm here. Yes, Harry said. The stone. Quirrell studied him. Then you know you can't let me have it. I know that's what I'm supposed to do, Harry said. Stop you. Get the stone. Save the day. He looked around the room, the mirror, the darkness, the faint residual magic of the trials he'd just come through, and something else, something layered over the room like a watermark, present but not announced. I'm also aware that there's someone else in this room besides you and me. The back of Quirrell's head moved. He's been listening since the 3rd room, Harry said. Possibly since the door. The magical signature is, it's not like anything I've encountered, but it's there. Incomplete. Fragmented. Like a copy of something rather than the original. Quirrell was very still. Voldemort, Harry said to the room at large, conversationally. I know you're what's under the turban. I've known since October. The garlic was a performance and the smell is wrong. It's not garlic covering a smell, it's garlic substituting for the absence of one. A body that's hosting something rather than inhabited by its original occupant has a particular magical signature. I read about it. He paused. I read about a lot of things. A voice came from behind Quirrell's head, thin and sharp and distinctly unpleasant, not quite a voice and not quite a sound. You are not what they told me you were. No, Harry agreed. What did they tell you I was? A child, the voice said. An untrained boy with a scar and a talent he doesn't understand. I have a scar, Harry said. I'm working on understanding the talent. He kept his eyes on Quirrell. You want the stone because you need a body. A real body, permanent, not a host. You want to come back. And you will stop me, said the voice. Probably not tonight, Harry said. Quirrell's eyebrows moved. Not because I want you to have it, Harry clarified. But because tonight is not the right moment and this room is not the right stage. He looked at the mirror. I know how Ariste works. I know that whoever desires the stone without wanting to use it will find it in their pocket. Dumbledore built the mirror into this protection because he knew it would work on someone with the right ethical orientation toward the stone. He met Quirrell's eyes. He built this for me. The whole thing. The whole trail. He expected me to come down here, retrieve the stone, survive through love and friendship and moral clarity, and emerge grateful and heroic in his. And instead, the voice said. Instead, I'm here with all of that information in my head, Harry said, and I'm choosing how to use it on my own terms, not his. He walked to the mirror. He looked in it. He saw himself, just himself, standing in the frame, and then his reflection reached into a pocket and held up the stone, and Harry felt it drop into his actual pocket with a warmth that moved through his palm and up his arm like a current. He kept his face neutral. I have the stone, he said. Quirrell lunged. The thing that happened next was fast. Quirrell's hands closed around Harry's arm and then Quirrell screamed, not performed screaming but the real thing, raw and tearing, as though the contact was burning him. Harry felt it, the copper-electric sensation not as a current but as a wave, something from the scar, something from whatever Lily had put into him, pushing back against the wrongness of Quirrell's presence. He hadn't known if it would work. He'd read that it might. He held on and Quirrell burned. When it was over, Quirrell was on the floor and the room smelled like ash and something colder than ash, and the thin voice was louder than before but also further away, like a signal losing frequency. This isn't finished, it said. No, Harry agreed. It isn't. Then it was gone. Harry stood in the room with the stone in his pocket and Quirrell crumpling on the floor and the mirror showing him his own face, and the copper-electric feeling settling back to its usual frequency like weather clearing after a storm. He breathed. He was fine. He was genuinely, physically fine, which was more of a surprise than he'd expected. Then he put the stone back in his pocket, went back through the purple flames, found Hermione and Neville waiting exactly where he'd left them, and said, "Get Madame Pomfrey." "Are you hurt?" Hermione demanded. "No. Quirrell is." He looked at both of them. "And we need to talk, but not here." Madame Pomfrey. McGonagall. Then, inevitably, Dumbledore. He came to the hospital wing at 9 that evening, moving through the door with the unhurried grace of someone who had all the time in the world and the certainty that the room would settle around his presence. He looked at Harry in the hospital bed. Pomfrey had insisted on observation even though Harry was demonstrably fine, with those extraordinary blue eyes, warm and bright and carrying the particular quality of someone who had rehearsed tenderness until it was real. "Harry," he said. He sat in the visitor's chair. McGonagall had left, Pomfrey was behind her screen, and it was just them. "Are you well?" "Yes," Harry said. "You were very brave tonight." The tone was warm, gravitational. "And very capable." "I confess I might have underestimated me," Harry said. Pleasantly. A pause. Those blue eyes watching him. "Yes," Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice that was genuine, real surprise, real re-evaluation, and underneath both of them something more careful and more interested than the warmth suggested. "I think perhaps I did." "The stone," Harry said. He took it out of his pocket and held it out. "I imagine you'd like this." Dumbledore took it, and something happened in his face, something quick and private that Harry catalogued. Not relief, exactly. More like the response of someone whose plan has concluded but not in the chapter they'd written for it. "Thank you," Dumbledore said. "Truly." "I have some questions," Harry said. "Not tonight. But I'll have them, and I'd like answers." "Of course," Dumbledore said. "I will always, I'd like honest ones," Harry said. "Not the version that's useful for me to have. The accurate version." The pause was longer this time. Those blue eyes did something complex, a reassessment that was also, Harry thought, a genuine respect being built in real time, which was interesting and which he tucked away. "I will try to give you that," Dumbledore said carefully. "That's a different answer from what you were about to say," Harry observed. The old man almost smiled. "Yes. It is." He stood. "You should rest." "I'm fine." "Rest anyway." He moved to the door, paused. "Your aunt," he said, without turning around. "She has been busy these past years." "She's a thorough person," Harry said. "Indeed." A pause. "You are very like her." "I try to be," Harry said. Dumbledore left. Harry lay in the hospital bed in the quiet of the wing with the stars visible through the high windows and thought about the pause before. "I will try to give you that." The pause was honest. The rest was performance, however warm and genuine the performance felt. But the pause was the man without the mythology, just for a second. Surprised into real response. He can be surprised, Harry thought. That's useful. In the morning he wrote to Petunia. He wrote the whole thing: Quirrell, Voldemort, the stone, the mirror, the hospital wing conversation. He wrote it clearly and without dramatics because she had no patience for dramatics, and in any case the facts were sufficient without them. He wrote about the pause before "I will try." He wrote at the end, "He knows you've been working. He doesn't know what you have. He said I was very like you," which I think was the most honest thing he said all night. Her response came back in 24 hours. "Good. Let him know you're watching. Don't let him know what you can see. The stone situation will generate questions in the wider wizarding world. Quirrell's death will need explaining. Watch how he explains it. Watch what he omits. Watch who asks questions and who doesn't, because the silence is as informative as the answers. You did exactly right. I'm very proud. P.S. Neville and Hermione. Trust them. Tell them more than feels comfortable. You've already started this and you can't do it alone." He showed them the letter. Not all of it, not the last line, which was his, but the strategic content. Hermione read it twice and then said, "She's right about the silence. I've been watching the Prophet's coverage this morning. The story is very curated." "What's being omitted?" Harry asked. "The stone's existence," she said. "They can't talk about it without explaining why it was at Hogwarts, and they can't explain that without explaining Dumbledore's decision to move it here," Harry said. "Right. So it's security incident at Hogwarts, no students harmed, suspected intruder neutralized. The intruder isn't named. The incident isn't detailed." She looked up. "He's controlling the narrative." "He always is," Harry said. "But he's spending something to do it this time." "What do you mean?" Neville asked. "Every time you suppress a true story, you leave an absence. People notice absences, eventually. You can only suppress so many before the absence itself becomes the story." Harry looked at the Prophet spread on the table. "He's been doing this for 40 years. Every suppression leaves a mark. We're building a record of the marks." "For what?" Hermione asked. He looked at her. Then at Neville. These two people, 3 weeks into his friendship with Neville, 8 weeks with Hermione, who had both shown him the thing he most needed from the people he worked with, not agreement, but genuine independent intelligence applied in good faith toward the same truth. "There's something bigger than the stone," he said. "Something I've known about for a while that I haven't fully explained to either of you." He paused. "I'm going to tell you everything. All of it, what my aunt found, what the Gringotts records showed, what the legal proceedings have uncovered. All the documentation we've built up over the past 5 years." He looked at them. "It's going to change how you see things." "Tell us," Hermione said, without hesitation. Neville nodded. So Harry told them. It took 3 hours, sitting in the corner of the common room after everyone else had gone to dinner, and he laid it out the way Petunia had always laid things out, facts first, inferences clearly labeled, questions marked as questions. The estate records. The Sirius Black situation. Dumbledore's executor role and what he'd done with it. The notation in the records about discretion required. The pattern of decisions that added up to something nobody had named yet but that had a shape, and the shape was not benign. Hermione listened with the focused processing attention she gave everything important, and Harry could see her working through it, not resistance, she was too intellectually honest for resistance, but rigor, checking it against what she already knew, looking for the places where the story didn't hold. At the end she said, "There are things here I need to verify independently." "Please do," Harry said. "Because if they verify, they will," he said. Not arrogantly. Just with the quiet certainty of someone who has been through the documents many times. "Then this is a story that has been deliberately hidden," she said. "Not just suppressed. Actively constructed to be invisible." "Yes. And you want to make it visible," Harry said. "On our terms. When the time is right. Not now, now is too early and the evidence is still incomplete. But we're building toward something." Neville had been quiet through most of the telling. He spoke now, in the careful manner of someone choosing words. "You're going to destroy his reputation." "I'm going to let the truth be public," Harry said. "The reputation will respond accordingly." "Those are the same thing." "Not quite," Harry said. "Destroying a reputation implies inventing or exaggerating. I'm not doing either. I don't need to. What's real is sufficient." Neville was quiet again. "Then, my parents," he said. "Yes," Harry said gently. "That's part of it too. I don't know all of it yet. But the Longbottom guardianship arrangement is in the files, and your parents' circumstances are adjacent to the same pattern." Neville looked at the fire. The reflection of it was in his eyes, not dramatic, just honest, the expression of someone absorbing something they've been circling for a long time without quite reaching. "Right," he said. "Then I'm in." "And me," Hermione said. "Obviously." Harry looked at both of them. He thought about Petunia's last line, "You can't do it alone," and about the specific relief of finding that he didn't have to, that the people he'd chosen were actually choosing back. "We have all summer to read and verify," he said. "And second year to start putting it together." The term ended. End of year feast, Gryffindor winning the House Cup in a manner that Harry found broadly performative but didn't object to because Neville's expression when his name was called for points was one of the genuinely good things that had happened this year. Dumbledore announced it with that warm particular affection he performed for the whole school, and Harry sat at the table and watched the old man work the room with the ease of someone who had been the center of gravity in rooms like this for decades. And then Harry stood up. He didn't plan it. Or rather, he planned it in the 3 seconds between standing and speaking, which was usually enough. He stood up at the Gryffindor table while Dumbledore was still speaking, a deliberate choice, a visible one, an interruption that was polite and also completely clear, and said, "I have a question." The Great Hall did the thing that Great Halls did, it went very quiet, very quickly. Dumbledore stopped, looked at Harry with those blue eyes, and waited with the gracious patience of someone expecting a compliment. "The stone," Harry said. "What's happening to it now?" A pause. "The whole hall holding." "It will be destroyed," Dumbledore said, after a fraction of a second too long. "Nicholas Flamel and I agreed that it is safest." "For whom?" Harry said. Another pause. Longer. "For everyone," Dumbledore said, and his voice was still warm but there was something underneath the warmth that Harry had not heard before, not anger, not quite. The quality of someone who has spotted a move they didn't plan around. "I ask," Harry said, in the same pleasant conversational tone, because there was no public knowledge that the stone was at Hogwarts this year. Or that Voldemort had attempted to acquire it. The students who were involved in stopping that attempt were 11 years old. He let that sit for a half-second. "I thought the wider wizarding community might have questions." "I certainly do." The silence in the great hall was extraordinary, the sound of 1,000 people doing the same calculation simultaneously. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. The warm blue eyes. The half-moon glasses. The whole magnificent construction of the man. "Your questions," he said, "are always welcome, Harry." "Thank you," Harry said pleasantly, and sat down. Next to him, Neville exhaled. Across the table, Hermione was writing something in the small notebook she carried everywhere. Under the table, unseen, Harry's hand was absolutely steady. He was 11 years old and he had just asked a question in public that Dumbledore couldn't answer without cost. It was a small crack. But cracks, he knew, didn't need to be large to be structural. They just needed to be in the right place. You found the seam. You pulled. You waited. He had plenty of patience. He had been trained by an expert. Chapter 5, The Chamber Beneath the Crown. The summer between first and second year was the most productive 3 months of Harry's life. Petunia had a system for summers, developed over the preceding decade. Mornings were study, afternoons were research, evenings were discussion. The system had evolved as Harry grew, the content changed, the depth changed, the balance of who was directing what changed, but the structure held because structure was how real work got done, and they were doing real work. This summer was different because Harry came home with 2 people's worth of verified questions and a crack in Dumbledore's public image that was small but deliberate, and Petunia had been watching the wizarding press since June with the careful attention of someone monitoring whether that was about to turn. "The prophet covered the end-of-year feast," she said, the morning after he arrived home, the 2 of them at the kitchen table with tea and toast and the relevant clippings spread between them. Vernon had made the toast and gone to work and kissed Harry on the top of the head on the way out, which he still did, and which Harry still pretended not to notice for reasons of dignity while clearly appreciating it. Page 4. Your question is mentioned in one sentence. A first-year student raised questions regarding the security incident, which the headmaster addressed. "He didn't address it," Harry said. "No. But the sentence implies he did." She tapped the clipping. "Watch this, watch how the language is constructed around him in every story that could be difficult. He never lies in public, not directly. He allows the construction of sentences to do it for him." Harry read the sentence again. "He answered a question," he said. "The question was whether my questions were welcome. Not whether he'd answer them." "Exactly." She set down her tea. "You did well. It was the right move at the right scale. A larger confrontation this early would have been dismissible as a child being dramatic. This was pointed. Specific. Public record. Hermione has it documented," Harry said. "And the prophet clipping. Good." She pulled a fresh folder from the stack beside her chair. Harry recognized the Gringotts seal on the tab. "There are developments on the legal front. The Sirius Black case review has moved to a formal inquiry. It won't go quickly, these things never do, but it's moved. The inquiry board includes 2 members who are not in Dumbledore's professional orbit, which is more than I expected." Harry straightened. "What do they need?" "Evidence of the original procedural failures. Which we have. The challenge is introducing it in a form the inquiry will accept from a non-magical witness." She looked at him. "Sharpfong is handling the Gringotts side. The solicitor is handling the procedural argument. What they still need is someone who can speak to the broader pattern, the estate decisions, the guardianship manipulation, in a way that connects it to the Black imprisonment as part of a single strategy rather than a series of coincidences." "Someone credible," Harry said. "Someone the Wisengamot won't dismiss," Petunia said. "Which is complicated, given what I am." "What about someone who isn't you?" Harry said. "Someone from inside the wizarding world who has access to the same pattern from a different angle." She looked at him. Augusta Longbottom, he said. Neville said she gets a look when she talks about Dumbledore and Azkaban. A door she decided not to open. What if we gave her a reason to open it? Petunia was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote the name at the top of a fresh page. Tell me what Neville told you. He told her. All of it, everything Neville had said, the things Neville hadn't said but implied, the quality of the relationship between Neville and his grandmother, which was formidably loving and formidably complicated simultaneously. He told her about Neville's parents, what he knew of the circumstances, the specific way the Lestrange trial had been conducted and what the public record showed and what it notably omitted. Petunia listened and wrote and asked precise questions. At the end she said, the Longbottom situation is adjacent to the Black situation in a specific way. Both families had the correct guardianship arrangements before 1981. Both were disrupted by the aftermath of that same 48-hour period, the night Voldemort fell. One ended in Azkaban without trial. One ended in St. Mungo's without ever being fully investigated. She paused. In both cases, the disruption created a vacuum. And in both cases, Dumbledore was positioned to act into that vacuum. He didn't have to create the crisis, Harry said. He just had to be ready for it. Which is worse, Petunia said. In some ways. She wrote Augusta Longbottom a letter that afternoon. Harry read it before she sealed it, careful, respectful, specific rather than general, offering information before asking for anything. She enclosed copies of 3 documents from the Gringotts files, not the most damaging ones, not yet, but ones that established that she had access to things Augusta Longbottom might want to see, and that she was not operating from rumor. The response came in 6 days. 2 sentences, I will meet with you. Name the place. The meeting was 2 weeks later, at a tea room in Edinburgh that was wizarding accessible but not in Diagon Alley, not in any location easily observed by the usual networks. Petunia went alone. Harry stayed home and read through the second set of files she'd prepared, which covered the financial trail of the Hogwarts Board of Governors from 1960 to 1991 and contained, when you followed it carefully, a pattern of influence that was not in any single transaction but was visible in the aggregate like a shape in fog. When Petunia came home she sat down at the kitchen table and said nothing for 90 seconds, which was long for her. She knew, Harry said. She knew some of it. Suspected more. Petunia picked up her tea, found it cold, set it back down. She has been carrying it alone. For 10 years. Because she had no evidence that would hold, and because she has a grandson to protect, and because going up against Dumbledore alone with suspicion and no documentation is how you end up discredited rather than heard. But now she's not alone. Now she's not alone. She looked at him. She wants to meet you. When? September. After you go back. She'll come to Hogsmeade for a Neville visit and we'll arrange something. Petunia paused, and something happened in her expression that was rare, something slightly undone. She said that Lily Evans was the best student she ever watched work, and that whatever Lily put into you she hoped we'd had the sense to give it room. Harry was quiet for a moment. Did you tell her about the research? All of it? The outline. She'll get the full files through Sharpfang, with your permission. She has it, Harry said. The summer continued. Hermione wrote twice a week, long, detailed letters that were essentially research reports, methodically working through the list Harry had given her, cross-referencing sources, flagging inconsistencies, building the kind of evidentiary structure that could survive serious scrutiny. Harry wrote back with questions, additional sources, the occasional observation that redirected her attention to something she'd passed over. The correspondence had a quality of excitement to it, the excitement of 2 people building something together at a distance and feeling it develop shape. Neville wrote shorter letters but more honest ones, news from his grandmother, small observations about the wizarding world seen from a family that had been inside it and wounded by it for a generation. He mentioned, in August, that his grandmother had had a visitor, and that she'd seemed different afterward. Lighter, he said. Like something had been redistributed. Harry also trained. This was the summer's other thread, less document-focused but equally important. He'd spent his first year at Hogwarts in classes designed for children who had no prior magical exposure, moving at a pace that was sensible for most of his classmates and frustrating for him. He had the theoretical foundation. What he needed was the practice, and practice required doing it, repeatedly, past the point of comfortable competence. He worked on transfiguration until the principles became instinct. He worked on charms until the wand movements were as natural as handwriting. He worked particularly on shield charms and the related defensive theory, because the one thing the stone confrontation had taught him was that he might be intellectually prepared for things his body and magic hadn't caught up with yet, and that gap was exploitable. He was not afraid of the work. He was never afraid of work. But he wanted to close the gap between what he knew and what he could do, and the gap was narrowing in a way that felt like coming into focus. By August's end he could hold a shield charm for 45 seconds against repeated physical impact, which was well beyond standard first to second year expectation, and his transfiguration was nearly third year level. He was not showing off. He simply wanted the tools available when he needed them. He went back to Hogwarts on September 1st on the train with Hermione and Neville, and the three of them spent the journey in the way they'd spent most of the summer, working. The Chamber of Secrets, Hermione said, pulling out her notebook. I found references in 3 separate pre-1900 texts. The story is consistent across sources. Salazar Slytherin built a chamber beneath the school containing a creature, details vary on the creature, that only his true heir could control. The heir of Slytherin would one day use it to purge Hogwarts of those he considered unworthy. She looked up. The language of true heir comes up in all 3 sources. It requires a Parselmouth, which is a hereditary magical ability running through certain old Slytherin line families, Harry said. And through Voldemort, Neville said. He's the last known descendant of Slytherin. So if the chamber is real, Hermione said, and if Voldemort is in some form still active, which given last year seems probable, then the chamber is relevant. It's also, Harry said carefully, the kind of thing Dumbledore would know about. The history of the school, a chamber built by one of the founders, there's no version of this where the headmaster of Hogwarts doesn't know. The train moved through the Scottish landscape and the light outside went long in gold. If he knows and hasn't addressed it, Hermione said, then either he can't, or it's useful to him to have it there, Harry said. An unresolved threat. Something that might activate and require exactly the right response. Neville was looking at his hands. You think it's going to happen this year? I think something is going to happen this year, Harry said. It usually does. He wasn't wrong. It started in October, which felt almost impatient. The writing appeared on the wall outside the entrance to the bathroom on the 2nd floor. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the heir, beware. And the first petrification was Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, hanging stiff from a torch bracket like a warning made concrete. Harry stood in the crowd looking at the wall, feeling the press of students around him and the particular quality of the moment, fear spreading through the crowd the way certain spells spread, the specific vibration of a community beginning to feel unsafe, and thought about timing. The chamber opening in October, barely a month into term, suggested something was accelerating. Something that had been latent was being activated. He looked at the message on the wall and felt the copper electric sensation hum in a specific register, not his own magic, something older and stranger, something that moved through the castle's foundations and made the stone resonate differently. Parseltongue, he thought. Somewhere in this castle, something that speaks in snakes. Dumbledore arrived behind them and stood for a moment, looking at the wall. Harry watched him. The old man's face gave very little, as always, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that Harry had learned to read. Not surprise. Not quite. The specific quality of someone encountering something they knew was coming and confirming that it had arrived. He caught Harry looking and gave him the warm, slightly sad expression of a man concerned for his students. Harry gave him a pleasant nod and kept his face completely neutral. It was Hermione who found the diary. Or rather, it found her, in the way that things connected to Voldemort had a tendency to find people when useful, which Harry recognized in retrospect. A small black diary in one of the U-Bend floods that accompanied Moaning Myrtle's periodic complaints, turning up in a bathroom at precisely the moment when Hermione was doing research on the chamber in the second-floor girls' bathroom because Myrtle had been first found there the last time the chamber opened. Hermione brought it to Harry, who looked at it without touching it, felt the magical signature, complex, cold, fractured in a way that reminded him of something, and said, "Don't write in it." She blinked. "How did you, the signature," he said. "It's the same register as Quirrell was. That fractured quality. Something that's a piece of something rather than a whole." He looked at it. "Last year I learned that Voldemort's soul can apparently be fragmented and persist independently of his body. I think this is a piece of him." Hermione's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: skepticism, rigorous recalibration, arrival at a position. A container for a fragment of soul. In a diary that someone put in a school. Deliberately? Neville asked. "Everything deliberate until proven otherwise," Harry said, which was one of Petunia's principles and one of his most used. He brought it to McGonagall that afternoon with Hermione and Neville, laid it on her desk, and explained his reasoning in the same clear factual manner he'd been trained to use. McGonagall listened with the intensity she brought to things she took seriously, which was most things. "That is a very significant claim, Mr. Potter," she said, when he finished. "I know," Harry said. "That's why I'm bringing it to you rather than investigating it myself." She looked at the diary. Then at Harry. "You mentioned last year's events." "Yes. And you believe this is connected?" "I believe they're both connected to the same source. I think someone is deliberately placing objects connected to Voldemort in accessible locations." He paused. "I think it's worth asking who had access to this school, this term and last, with the ability and motivation to place them." McGonagall picked up the diary with her wand, not her hand, and examined it with the focused attention of someone who had been dealing with dark objects for 40 years. Her expression confirmed what he'd suspected before she spoke. She knew what she was looking at. "I'm going to take this to the headmaster," she said. "Of course," Harry said. "I'd appreciate knowing what he says." She gave him a look that was part sharp and part something that might have been reluctant appreciation. "I'll keep you informed of what is appropriate to share." "Thank you," Harry said, which was not agreement but was polite. The petrifications continued through November. Hermione was the 5th victim, which was the worst morning of Harry's year, worse than anything that had happened the previous year, worse than Quirrell, worse than the stone. He stood in the hospital wing looking at her on the bed, rigid and cold-eyed and breathing but not present, and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest that was not grief, not yet, because grief required the ending and this wasn't ending, he wasn't going to let it end. She had a piece of paper in her hand, frozen solid in her grip. It took the nurses several minutes to ease it free without damage. When they got it out, Harry unfolded it and read what was on it. Hermione's research notes, in her handwriting, from the past 3 weeks. She'd been close. Closer than him, he realized with a flash of something that was equal parts admiration and guilt. She'd identified the basilisk on her own, from fragmented source texts and the specific pattern of the petrifications rather than the kills. Pipes, she'd written at the bottom. It moves through the pipes. And beside that, one word circled, Parseltongue. Harry read it twice and then looked at Neville, who had come to the hospital wing with him and was standing beside him reading over his shoulder. "She worked it out," Neville said quietly. "She worked it out," Harry agreed. "A basilisk," Neville said. "In the pipes. Controlled by someone who speaks Parseltongue." Harry folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. "Someone in this school." Neville was quiet. Then, It has to be a student. Or someone using a student. The diary, Harry said. But we gave it to McGonagall, we gave her a copy of the threat, Harry said. Not the source. If there are other objects, he stopped. He thought about what Petunia had said about Dumbledore knowing, and what knowing without addressing implied, and a new thought arrived that was darker than its predecessors. The diary was always going to come to someone. It was placed here deliberately. Which means there's a plan. He looked at Hermione on the bed, rigid and unreachable. Someone's running a plan and we've been reactive to it this whole year. He went that evening to the library, the restricted section, which he could access via a password that Professor Flitwick had given him without restriction when Harry's first-year exam results had prompted a 3-minute conversation about academic progress that had concluded with Flitwick writing the password on a slip of paper with the expression of a man who recognizes someone who is going to find their way in there regardless and prefers it be official, and pulled every text on basilisks, on Parseltongue heredity, and on soul magic he could find. He sat in the corner until midnight with the lamp close and a scratching quill and the particular focused energy that arrived when the picture was coming together faster than he could write. The basilisk moved through the pipes. It killed by direct eye contact and petrified via reflections or indirect view, which was why the victims were alive. They'd seen it secondhand, through water, or a mirror or a ghost. It was controlled by a Parselmouth. It was controlled, specifically, by whatever was operating through the diary. He wrote to Petunia that night. He told her about the diary, the basilisk, the petrifications, Hermione. He told her his theory about soul fragments. He told her about the specific quality of the magical signature he'd felt on the diary and asked whether she knew of any existing research on magical objects used as soul containers. He sent it with the school owl and went to bed and in the morning had charms at 9 and ate breakfast with Neville and felt Hermione's absence at the table like a missing tooth and kept working. Petunia's response took 3 days, which suggested she'd used the time for research before writing back. When it came it was 4 pages. The term for what the diary was, she wrote, was a Horcrux. She found it referenced in 3 texts she'd acquired through the network over the years, all pre-20th century, all treating the subject with the gravity of something genuinely taboo. The definition, a dark magical object in which a fragment of a person's soul has been deliberately anchored, created through an act of murder, providing the creator with a measure of immortality as long as the Horcrux remained intact. The important detail, the soul fragment was not contained by the Horcrux in the way water was contained by a vessel. It was active. It could interact with its environment. Given sufficient opportunity, a receptive host, sustained emotional contact, it could possess. He sat with that for a long time. Given sufficient opportunity, a receptive host, sustained emotional contact, it could possess. He thought about who had been carrying the diary. Who else might have had it before Hermione found it in the flood? He went to Ginny Weasley's dormitory by request, which required a short note via the prefects, and she came to meet him in the common room looking like someone who hadn't been sleeping well for 2 months. She was sitting across from him for 3 minutes before she said, without him asking, "I've been writing in it." Harry kept his voice entirely neutral. "For how long?" "Since the beginning of term. I found it. It was in my books when I started packing for school and I thought someone had put it there by mistake." She was looking at her hands. It wrote back. At first it was nice. It listened. I told it things. Her voice was getting smaller. And then I started losing time. I'd wake up and I'd be somewhere I hadn't gone to sleep, or I'd find things on my hands I didn't remember. Ink. Or something that wasn't ink. Did you know what was happening to you? Not at first. She looked up and her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been frightened for a long time and is deeply relieved to be allowed to say so. I tried to get rid of it. I put it down a toilet. Myrtle's bathroom. She paused. I thought it was gone. Hermione found it there, Harry said. A week later. Ginny looked at him with horror. The petrifications, he said gently. You don't remember? There are whole nights I don't remember. Her voice was very quiet. Ginny. He leaned forward. This is not your fault. You were 11 years old and you were handed something deliberately constructed to do exactly what it did to you. This was done to you. Not by you. He watched her face absorb this. I need to know, is there anywhere else the diary might have been kept? Anyone else who might have given it to you? She told him. It took 20 minutes and a mug of tea from the common room kitchen. He sent a 4th year for it because Ginny needed the warmth and the time, and the picture that emerged was this. The diary had been placed in Ginny's cauldron at Diagon Alley, at Madame Malkin's, at the beginning of September, in the confusion of the back-to-school rush. She'd assumed it was a mistake and meant to return it, but then it had been such good company, and she was lonely, and she stopped. Who were you near? Harry said carefully. At Madame Malkin's. Something moved in her face. Draco Malfoy's father, she said. He was helping Draco with his robes. He went through my cauldron. I thought he was checking if it was the right size. I didn't, Lucius Malfoy, Harry said. He kept his face neutral through the conversation, took Ginny to McGonagall with himself and Neville as company, made sure she was not alone in the telling of it, and ensured that McGonagall heard the name Lucius Malfoy with the full context, after which McGonagall's expression became very particular and very still. Then Harry went back to his dormitory and wrote down the chain of events in his notebook in the precise factual way he'd been trained, and at the end wrote, Lucius Malfoy places a Horcrux belonging to Voldemort into the school via an 11-year-old girl. The Horcrux uses her to open the Chamber of Secrets and operate the basilisk, petrifying students and creating a crisis. Purpose, unclear in full. Possible purposes, distract from other events, create conditions for political intervention, e.g. closure of school or removal of Dumbledore as headmaster, advance Voldemort's interests in a deniable way. He underlined deniable. Then he wrote, Dumbledore knew about the chamber. He knew about the basilisk. The 1943 incident is in the school records and he was on staff then. He knew Voldemort was Slytherin's heir, specifically, because he knew about the prophecy and the soul fragments. He has known all of this for 50 years and the chamber is still accessible. Why? He sat with the question. He thought about the stone, built as a trial, a designed experience, a funnel toward a particular conclusion. He thought about the diary, placed deliberately, used to open a crisis. He thought about what Petunia had said about useful threats and orchestrated necessity and the specific utility of fear in a population looking for someone to trust. He thought, what if the crisis isn't accidental? Not meaning Dumbledore placed the diary. He didn't believe that, and not believing it was important to be precise about. But if someone like Lucius Malfoy placed it, and someone like Dumbledore knew it existed and knew what it could do and did not seal the entrance to the chamber despite having 50 years to do so, then the crisis was not Dumbledore's creation, but the conditions for it were ones he'd maintained. Because a crisis that only he could resolve made him necessary. Because every time the world was frightened and he was the answer, the mythology strengthened. He closed the notebook and went to the hospital wing and sat with Hermione for an hour, which was something he did every other day, because she couldn't hear him but the work she'd done had mattered and he thought she'd want to know he knew. Basilisk, he told her. Moved through the pipes, controlled by soul fragment in a diary, placed by Lucius Malfoy, operated through Ginny Weasley. You had it before anyone. He paused. We're going to fix it. Then I'm going to do something about the larger situation, and I need you back for that part. He sat in silence for a moment. The antidote for basilisk petrification is mandrake restorative draft, he said. Sprout's mandrakes are almost mature. 2-3 weeks. He looked at her face, pale and still and full of Hermione with nowhere for any of it to go. I'll have everything documented by then. He left the hospital wing and went to find Neville. They went into the chamber on a Wednesday. Not because Wednesday was significant but because on Wednesday the last of the staff meetings ran until 9, which emptied most of the upper floors, and because Neville had spent Tuesday evening reconfirming that the section of pipe access from Moaning Myrtle's bathroom was exactly where Hermione's notes had indicated, and because Harry had spent Monday night practicing Parseltongue, which was not a thing he could practice in the conventional sense, but he could practice paying attention to. The part of him that felt the magical signatures, and the Parseltongue came when he was paying attention to it. He didn't tell Dumbledore. He did, however, leave a sealed letter with Professor Flitwick with instructions to deliver it to Dumbledore's office if Harry didn't present himself to a staff member by 7 the following morning. "What's in it?" Neville asked, when they were in the bathroom. "Everything," Harry said. "All of it, the Horcrux theory, the basilisk, Lucius Malfoy, Ginny's testimony. If something happens to me tonight, it doesn't disappear." He looked at Neville. "You don't have to come. You'd need someone at the top of the pipe," Neville said practically. "To help Ginny out and raise the alarm if you don't come back." "Yes. So I'm coming," Neville said, in the tone he used when the decision was made and the conversation was therefore complete. Harry looked at Myrtle's bathroom, felt the copper-electric sensation hum up from the floor, and hissed at the sink. The basilisk was below the school and it was enormous and old, and the chamber itself was ancient in the way only deliberately built things could be ancient. It had been designed to impress, the soaring columns with the carved serpents, the long vista of stone, the green-tinted dimness that turned everything cold and singular. Harry moved through it with his eyes averted and his hearing at full extension, tracking the movement of something massive through the dark. The voice found him before the creature did. Not a voice from a person present, a voice from a year, from a diary, from a fragment of something that had been 16 years old once and had made choices that had taken it somewhere irrevocable. Tom Riddle's memory, solid and confident and very nearly amused, standing at the end of the chamber with Ginny unconscious beside him and a wand in his hand. "You came," Riddle said. "I thought you might not." Dumbledore's little hero, choosing to manage things carefully from a distance. He looked at Harry with Voldemort's eyes in a younger face, the Slytherin crest on his robes, the particular quality of someone very intelligent who has made peace with being monstrous. "But here you are." "Here I am," Harry agreed. He kept his eyes toward the ground, tracking the chamber layout by memory. "How much of you is actually in there?" "Enough," Riddle said. "More than enough to do what's needed." "Which is take enough life from Ginny to become solid," Harry said. "I know how it works. Horcruxes aren't as secret as you'd like, there are texts." He paused. "You made more than one." Something shifted in Riddle's expression. Harry had been watching for it. "How many?" Harry said. "More than you can destroy," Riddle said. "More than Dumbledore knows about. He thinks he understands you, boy, he thinks you're here because you're brave and loyal and everything he built you to be. He doesn't know what you actually are." "No," Harry said. "He doesn't." The basilisk moved. Harry felt it, the vibration in the stone, the displacement of air, the specific heat signature of something very large and very alive, and dropped and rolled left without looking, and Riddle made a sound of surprise because he'd expected paralysis or flight, and the basilisk's gaze swept through the space Harry had been standing in half a second before. Harry hissed. He hadn't been certain it would work, hadn't been certain the Parseltongue he could manage was sufficient for command rather than just communication. But the basilisk stopped. In the green-tinted dark the enormous head swung toward him, and Harry felt the wrongness of those eyes like a pressure at the edge of his averted vision, and said, "Stop. Still. Wait." The basilisk was still. Riddle made a sharp movement with the wand. Harry cast the shield before he consciously decided to, and the spell broke against it and the shield held, and Harry thought, 6 weeks of training, 45 seconds, it's holding. He rolled again, and the basilisk was still frozen in the Parseltongue command, and Harry pulled the diary from his pocket. He had brought a basilisk fang. He had brought it in his boot, specifically, which was a level of preparation that he would later admit to Neville had felt slightly excessive at the time and no longer did. "You can't," Riddle said. Harry drove the Fong through the diary. The scream that followed was not human in any register he had language for. Riddle came apart from the edges, the solid construction of him dissolving inward like a tide retreating, the wand dropping and clattering on the stone floor, the face losing coherence and then losing everything, and Harry held the destroyed diary and felt the cold signature of it go dark and still and finally silent. The basilisk, without the Parseltongue command holding it, moved. Harry had anticipated this. He hissed again, away, through there, the pipes, go, and the basilisk, ancient and confused and suddenly without direction, turned and moved back into the darkness of the chamber's lower sections. He heard it go. He stood for a moment in the empty air of the chamber with the destroyed diary in one hand and Lily's protection still warm from the Fong wound on his palm and the copper-electric feeling singing steadily through the stone around him. Then he went to Ginny. She was breathing. Pale and cold and breathing, the color beginning to return as whatever Riddle had been taking from her was released. Harry picked her up. She was small, she was 11 years old and she weighed almost nothing, and carried her back toward the pipe entrance. He stopped once, in the middle of the chamber, and looked back at it, the centuries of it, the deliberate architecture, the columns with the carved serpents, Salazar Slytherin's monument to everything he believed should divide people. He thought about what Riddle had said. More than Dumbledore knows about. It wasn't posturing. He'd felt the truth of it in the quality of the voice, not a taunt, a fact. More than one Horcrux. More than Dumbledore knew. He thought about the prophecy, and about the specific utility of a child who could survive Voldemort's repeated attacks, and about why Dumbledore might prefer to leave that child in mortal danger rather than arm them with complete information. He thought about the letter with Flitwick, and about what Dumbledore's face would look like when he read it. He carried Ginny up through the pipe and found Neville waiting with a rope and a straightforwardly practical plan for getting an unconscious person up a vertical pipe that made Harry think, not for the first time, that Neville Longbottom was one of the most genuinely useful people he'd ever met. At 11:30, in Dumbledore's office, Harry sat across from the old man with Ginny recovering with Pomfrey, Neville in the waiting room, the destroyed diary on the desk between them, and the letter with everything in it, sitting on top of the desk as well, having been retrieved from Flitwick by Dumbledore's own message before Harry arrived. Dumbledore looked at the diary. He looked at the letter. He looked at Harry. "You went alone," he said. "You didn't come to me." "I left documentation," Harry said. "In case I didn't come back, everything I knew would have been with you. I might have helped you." "You might have," Harry said. "Or you might have managed it in a way that was useful to you." He kept his voice even. "I've learned to be careful about which of those is happening." Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. The blue eyes were doing something complicated, pain and assessment and something else, something that Harry thought might be the closest thing to genuine reckoning he'd seen in the man. "What's in the letter?" Dumbledore said. It wasn't quite a question. "Everything I know," Harry said. "The Horcruxes." The plural. The pause was brief but absolute. "He told you," Dumbledore said. "He told me there were more than you knew about." He seemed confident. Harry looked at him. "Are there?" Another long pause. The fire crackled. The portraits on the walls shifted and murmured. Outside the high windows, the castle moved and breathed through its stones the way it always did, ancient and indifferent to the specific conversations in its rooms. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I believe there are. And you've known." "I've suspected. For some years." "And your plan," Harry said, "for addressing that?" "The full plan." "What does it involve?" The pause this time was the longest one yet. "It involves you," Dumbledore said, quietly. "I know," Harry said. "I've known for a while. I want to know how." Dumbledore looked at him across the desk, the young man and the old one, the boy who had been prepared for this conversation for 11 years and the man who had been preparing a different version of it for the same amount of time, and Harry thought, "He's deciding how much to tell me." He's running the calculation. I think, Harry said, that you should give me the honest version. The one where you tell me everything you know, including the parts you've decided I shouldn't have yet. He paused. Because I'm going to find out regardless. The only question is whether you tell me or I find it in records. Something happened in Dumbledore's face. Not defeat, Dumbledore didn't have a face for defeat. But adjustment. Genuine, reluctant, honest adjustment. You are, he said slowly, not what I planned for. No, Harry agreed. Your aunt has been thorough, Harry said. Yes. She is a remarkable woman, Dumbledore said, and there was no performance in it. Just truth. I'll tell her you said so. Another silence. Then Dumbledore reached across the desk and opened a drawer and took out a folder that was not, Harry noted, something retrieved for this meeting but something that was already there. Already prepared. The calculation about how much to tell him had been running for a while, evidently. Maybe since the Great Hall. There is something, Dumbledore said, that you need to know. About the night your parents died. About what Voldemort did, and what it means. He set the folder on the desk. It is not information I have shared with anyone. It is also not information I can in good conscience continue to withhold from you. Harry looked at the folder. It concerns you directly, Dumbledore said. Harry put his hand on the folder. Tell me, he said. The fire in Dumbledore's office burned low and warm and the portraits watched and the castle breathed, and Dumbledore began to speak. Harry listened, and built the shape of it in his head as it arrived, and when Dumbledore finished, the room was very quiet and Harry sat completely still for the space of 30 seconds with the full picture finally, completely assembled in his mind. Then he said, "You were going to let me find this out at the end." When there was no time to choose. Dumbledore looked at him. Yes. Because if I knew earlier, I might choose differently. Yes. And you needed me to choose the way the prophecy required. Yes, Dumbledore said, and the word was very small. Harry stood up. He picked up the folder and the destroyed diary and his letter, and he stood in Dumbledore's office with the full weight of what he'd just learned sitting somewhere in his chest, not heavy, actually, or not only heavy, but complex and clear and finally known, which was different from every version of heavy he'd ever felt before, and he looked at Albus Dumbledore across the desk. I want a full meeting, he said. With you, with my aunt, and with Augusta Longbottom. Before the end of term. He kept his voice level. I'm not going to make decisions about my own life based on partial information. Not even for the greater good. He paused. Especially not for that. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. You are very much your mother's son, he said. Yes, Harry said. And my aunt raised me. He left. The ministry letter arrived at Dumbledore's office the following morning. Harry didn't send it, Petunia had prepared it months ago, triggered by a specific set of conditions that Harry had outlined to her in August, conditions that had now been met. It came from the Gringotts solicitor, countersigned by Augusta Longbottom, filed with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and copied to 3 members of the Wisengamot. It requested a formal inquiry into events of the 1991-92 academic year at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. It cited the presence of a dangerous dark artifact in the school, the petrification of 7 students and 1 staff member, the use of a minor as an unwitting agent of possession, and the question of institutional responsibility. It named, specifically, the role of a diary connected to Tom Marvolo Riddle in the events described. And it named Lucius Malfoy as the individual who had introduced the artifact to the school. Harry stood in the corridor outside the hospital wing when Hermione woke, 2 days after the chamber, the Mandrake draft having been administered the previous night, and watched her sit up and look around and say, in the voice of someone whose mind had been running even in its enforced stillness, the basilisk. I was right about the basilisk. You were, he said. Entirely. She looked at him with the sharp-eyed clarity of someone returning to a conversation that had been paused without warning. What happened? Quite a lot, he said. I'll tell you everything. We have 2 weeks of term left and a ministry inquiry starting and a meeting to arrange with Dumbledore and my aunt. He sat down on the edge of her bed. Are you well enough to take notes? She reached for her notebook from the bedside table. Tell me, she said. Chapter 6, The Truth Has No Master. The meeting happened on the 22nd of June, 3 days before the end of term, in a room at the Hog's Head that Aberforth Dumbledore, who had been watching his brother's mythology with the specific contempt of someone who had spent 60 years being the other one, rented to Petunia without comment or apparent curiosity, which told Harry that Aberforth knew exactly what the room was being used for and found the prospect broadly agreeable. Harry had arranged it. Not alone, Petunia had the legal architecture, Augusta Longbottom had the Wisengamot contacts, Sharpfong had provided the financial documentation in a sealed Gringotts folio that sat at the center of the table like a loaded weapon, but Harry had written the letter to Dumbledore himself, had chosen the location himself, had set the terms himself. The terms were simple: full disclosure, both directions, no proxies, no performance. Dumbledore arrived on time, which said something. He came without McGonagall, without Fawkes, without the ambient grandeur he usually moved through rooms with, and he sat down across from Petunia Evans-Desley and Augusta Longbottom with the stripped-down quality of someone who has made a decision about how to be in a room before entering it. Petunia looked at him for the first time in 11 years. The last time had been the Wisengamot hearing, across a formal chamber, with advocates between them, the whole apparatus of institutional procedure creating distance. This was different. A table. 4 chairs. Morning light coming through low windows onto stone walls. Aberforth's goats audible somewhere below. Mrs. Dursley, Dumbledore said. His voice was quiet and without ornamentation. Headmaster, Petunia said. Her voice was the same. Augusta Longbottom said nothing. She sat with the specific quality of a woman who has been waiting for this room for 10 years and intends to extract full value from it. Harry sat beside his aunt and set his notebook on the table and uncapped his pen. I'll take notes, he said. For the record. Dumbledore looked at the notebook, and then at Harry, and something moved in his face that was too complex to name quickly. He said, of course. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Harry had expected it to be a confrontation, a collision, 2 opposing architectures meeting under pressure. What it actually was, he thought afterward, was closer to a demolition conducted by mutual agreement. Dumbledore came in having decided, somewhere between Harry's office visit and this morning, that the version of events where he controlled the narrative entirely had passed its expiry. What remained was the question of what came next and who held what. He told them about the Horcruxes. All of them, not just the diary, the complete picture he'd built over years of careful, solitary research, the fragments of Voldemort's soul distributed across objects he'd identified and was in the process of identifying. He named them, the diary, now destroyed. A ring that had belonged to the Gaunt family, hidden in a shack in Little Hangleton. A locket that had once belonged to Slytherin himself, currently, after a long and complicated history involving a cave and a false location, unknown. A cup from the Hufflepuff vault. A diadem he suspected was in Hogwarts itself. An animal, the snake, Nagini, whom Voldemort had yet to fully acquire. He told them the 7th thing. He told it quietly. He looked at Harry when he said it, not away, and the blue eyes were doing something Harry had not seen in them before, which was the specific quality of a man in the presence of a wrong he cannot undo but is choosing to name anyway. The 7th Horcrux was Harry. Not intentionally created. Not placed deliberately. A fragment of Voldemort's soul had broken from the force of its own failed killing curse and attached itself to the only living thing in the room, an infant with enough raw magical power to sustain it. It lived in Harry's scar. It had been there for 11 years. The room was very quiet when he finished. Petunia was absolutely still. Harry watched her process it. She was faster than most people and more controlled than anyone he knew, and she was still for exactly 8 seconds before she said, in a voice that was completely level, "You have known this for how long?" "I have suspected it since Harry was 3 years old," Dumbledore said. "I confirmed it to my own certainty 4 years ago." "For years," Augusta Longbottom said. She said it the way she said most things, as a fact being entered into evidence. "Yes." "And your plan," Petunia said, "involved telling him when?" "At the appropriate moment," Dumbledore said. Then, before Petunia could respond, which is not a satisfactory answer. "I know it is not. The appropriate moment, in my design, was when the other Horcruxes had been located and destroyed and there was no remaining choice but the last one." He stopped. "I designed a situation in which Harry would be given information at a point where the emotional weight of it and the urgency of the circumstance would make the only available conclusion seem like his own decision. I did this deliberately." The silence was longer this time. "You were going to send him to die," Harry said, believing he'd chosen it. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "The word I used to myself was sacrifice. I want you to know I understood the weight of it. I want you to know it cost me something, truly. And I also want you to know that neither of those things changes what it was." Harry looked at him. He thought about all the years of preparation, all of Petunia's careful architecture, all the documents and the legal proceedings and the nights sitting in the kitchen working through the shape of what Dumbledore was and what he'd done and why. He had built a picture of a man who was brilliant and loving and deeply, structurally wrong in a way that had cost people everything. The picture was accurate. Sitting across from the original, the picture held. He also thought, and this was the thing he hadn't fully expected to feel, the thing that was not in any of Petunia's preparations because it couldn't have been, that Dumbledore was telling the truth right now. Not a managed truth. Not the version that served him. The actual one, with its full cost visible. It didn't change anything. It did change what came next. "The fragment in my scar," Harry said. "Can it be removed?" Dumbledore looked at him. "I don't know. I allowed myself to believe it could not be, because the alternative was finding a solution that didn't require my death," Harry said. "Which would have changed your plan." "Yes. So you didn't look hard enough." The pause was very long. "No," Dumbledore said. "I don't believe I did." Petunia opened the Gringotts folio. She did it deliberately, setting the pages out with the calm efficiency of a person who has been waiting to do this since 4 a.m. on the 1st of November 1981, and she began to speak. She presented it the way she'd always presented things to Harry, facts first, inferences clearly labeled, questions marked as questions. The estate records and what they showed. The financial instruments adjusted during Dumbledore's executorship. The letter vault. The guardianship manipulation. The serious black imprisonment, the procedural failures, the timeline, the evidence of influence. The pattern across 40 years of institutional adjacency, the accumulation of convenient outcomes, the mythology built stone by stone from managed information and strategic silence. Augusta Longbottom added her portion, the Longbottom guardianship irregularities. The specific way the investigation into the Lestrange's attack had been conducted, what had been prioritized and what had not, the particular questions that had never been asked about how the Death Eaters had known where Frank and Alice were. The question she had been carrying for 10 years like a stone and had never been able to put down, who had the Longbottom's location, and how had it moved? Dumbledore listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not manage or redirect. He sat with it and Harry watched his face absorb the shape of what he'd built, seen from the outside, and it was the most honest thing Harry had ever seen the man do, the full, undefended reckoning with the architecture of your own decisions laid out before you. When Petunia finished, he said, "The Longbottom location. I don't know how it moved. I want you to believe that." "I do," Augusta said. "I believe you didn't give it. I also believe you were surrounded, for decades, by people and systems you built and curated and trusted, and that trust was occasionally occasionally, placed in people who had divided loyalties. And that you chose not to look too closely at that because looking closely would have disrupted systems you needed. Yes, Dumbledore said. That is not the same as innocence, Augusta said. No. It is not. Harry wrote the exchange down verbatim. The meeting moved into its second half, which was less about what had happened and more about what happened next. Harry had prepared this section with Petunia in the weeks after the chamber, had thought about it carefully, had resisted the version that was satisfying in the way explosions were satisfying and arrived at the version that was actually useful. The Ministry inquiry is active, Harry said. Lucius Malfoy will be investigated for the diary. That's in motion and we're not stopping it. The evidence is in official hands and it moves regardless of this room. He looked at Dumbledore. What I want to discuss is the broader documentation. The files your aunt has built, Dumbledore said. Yes. There are two ways those become public. He kept his voice even. One is that we take them to the Prophet and the Wisengamot simultaneously and release everything at once, which will be comprehensive. Every decision, every financial adjustment, every managed narrative. Everything. It will be a complete demolition of your public standing, accomplished rapidly and without your input, and it will also be chaotic, because some of what it reveals will be genuinely frightening to a population that relies on the mythology to feel safe. Dumbledore was very still. The other way, Harry said, is that you begin the work of transparency yourself. Not as a confession extracted under pressure. As an actual accounting, public and documented, of decisions made and their consequences. A genuine record. One where the people who were most affected, the families who lost people, the estates that were mismanaged, the individuals whose rights were bypassed, receive acknowledgement and where applicable restitution. And in exchange? Dumbledore said. It's not an exchange, Harry said. There's no deal where you get to control the pace of truth in return for cooperation. The truth is going where it's going. The question is whether it goes with your voice as part of it, explaining your reasoning and your failures honestly, or whether it goes without you and you become a story told entirely by other people. Dumbledore was quiet for a very long time. You want me to account for myself, he said. I want the people you affected to have the full picture, Harry said. You accounting for yourself is part of that, yes. And the Horcrux in your scar, Dumbledore said. My plan, the plan you've described as sending you to die, that plan had the virtue of being one I understood. What you're proposing instead is that we find another solution. I want you to know that I haven't found one. I know, Harry said. You haven't looked properly. We will. We, Dumbledore said. With Gringotts, Petunia said. They have research access to pre-ministry dark magic archives that the wizarding establishment has never fully catalogued. Sharpfong has already commissioned a preliminary literature review. She looked at Dumbledore over the table with the even gaze she reserved for facts being deployed. In the 3 weeks since Harry told me the full picture, I found 2 potential theoretical frameworks that your 40 years of individual research apparently didn't encounter. A pause. I mention this not to be unkind but because it is relevant. You have been working alone, inside your own knowledge, shaping your conclusions to fit the plan you'd already built. That is the wrong way to solve a problem. Something happened in Dumbledore's face that was, and Harry documented it in his notebook as such, the clinical part of his mind running even in the midst of this, genuine, unguarded humility. The real kind, the difficult kind, the kind that arrived not as performance but as recognition. You're right, he said, to Petunia. And then, your father was a squib. Yes, she said. He was, I remember him. From when Lily was tested. He asked me more questions than any parent I'd spoken with before or since. His voice had a quality that was almost careful. I thought he was anxious. I think now he was already building something. He was, Petunia said. He left it to me. And you built it further. For 20 years, she said. Because I had nothing else to do with what you decided I was. The words landed in the room with the specific weight of a truth that has been carried a long time and finally set down on a table. Dumbledore looked at her. What I told you when you were 11, he said slowly, was correct in the technical sense. You do not possess active magical ability. But I told it to you in a way that was designed to close a door, because I had not yet learned, and perhaps have still not fully learned, to see the value in what exists on the threshold. He paused. I was wrong. Not about the technical fact. About what I concluded from it. About what I said to an 11-year-old girl who could feel magic in the air and was being told she didn't belong to it. The room was very quiet. Harry watched his aunt's face. Petunia Evans Desley had been carrying that conversation since she was 11 years old. Had converted it into fuel, had built something extraordinary from the exclusion, had raised a child in the space the exclusion created, had constructed a legal and evidential architecture from the margins of a world that had told her she didn't matter. She had never, in all of Harry's observation of her, let it be a wound. She had never let it be a wound in front of him. It was a wound. She said, "That is the first time anyone from your world has said that to me." "I know," Dumbledore said. "I'm sorry. For what it is worth at this distance, I am genuinely sorry." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at the folio and turned to the next page, and her voice was precisely as level as it always was, and Harry thought, she'll process it later. The same way she always processes things. Alone, at night, at the kitchen table with tea. He thought, I'll be there. They worked through the rest of the agenda, the serious black inquiry, the specific evidence Gringotts would submit, the timeline for the broader accountability documentation. Dumbledore agreed to everything. Not easily, there were negotiations on the pace and the form, genuine disagreements about what transparency required and what it permitted, but he agreed, and the agreement had the quality of something that was going to hold because it wasn't built on fear. Augusta Longbottom produced a document at the end, a formal statement from herself as Neville's guardian and as a member of the Longbottom family, requesting that the historical record of the war years include a full independent audit of the decisions made in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement between October and December 1981. She put it on the table and Dumbledore signed his name as a supporting signatory without being asked. She looked at his signature for a moment. Then she folded the document and put it in her robes and said, "I have a grandson who has been told he's not good enough since he was 5 years old, because he didn't show the magical aptitude the family expected after his parents. He is going to know, starting today, that the judgments of people who decided he wasn't enough were made by people whose judgment was flawed in other significant ways." She looked at Dumbledore. "I'm not forgiving you. I want to be clear about that." "I understand," he said. "But I'm also not going to pretend that this room didn't happen." She stood, smoothing her robes with the precision of someone who has survived terrible things by maintaining standards. "Good morning, headmaster." She left. Harry and Petunia packed up the folio and the notebooks. Dumbledore remained seated, looking out the low windows at the Hogsmeade Street, and Harry thought he looked, for the first time since Harry had known him, something that was specifically old. Not in the obvious sense, Dumbledore had always been obviously old, magnificently, historically old. Old in the internal sense. Like someone to whom the full weight of the miles had just become visible. "The Horcrux research," Harry said, at the door. "I want weekly updates from whatever you find. Not summaries. The actual research." "You'll have it," Dumbledore said. "And I want Sirius Black released before the end of summer." A pause. "The inquiry will conclude correctly if the right evidence is submitted," Harry said. "You have the influence to ensure it's submitted to the right board members. Use it correctly this time." Dumbledore looked at him. "You know the evidence isn't complete. We can't be certain. He's been in Azkaban for 11 years without a trial," Harry said. "He is my godfather by legal designation. The uncertainty is not a reason to leave him there." It's a reason to give him an actual trial, which is all we're asking." He looked at the old man. He should have had that in November of 1981. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "He should have." Harry left. The end-of-year feast was 3 days later. The hall had its usual terminal term quality, the barely managed chaos of 1,000 students who had finished exams and were still required to be somewhere for one more formal meal before the freedom of summer. The Gryffindor table was loud and warm. Neville was explaining something about herbology to Ron Weasley with the particular animation he had when talking about plants, which was a version of Neville that Harry had made a point of actively creating space for all year. Ginny Weasley was sitting 3 seats down, recovered and quiet in a new way, not the anxious quiet of someone waiting for something bad, but the specific quiet of someone who has been through something and come out the other side with a clearer idea of their own resilience than they'd arrived with. She'd been to see Harry twice in the past 2 weeks, not about the chamber. She'd processed the chamber with Pomfrey and her mum and seemed to be doing it well, but about the broader situation. She asked good questions and she was angrier about what Lucius Malfoy had done than she was afraid of it, which Harry thought was healthy and accurate in equal measure. Hermione was beside Harry, notebook open at the edge of the table in the way she carried it everywhere, currently not writing but with the cap off the pen because she was in a conversation that might generate notes. They were talking about the Horcrux research, specifically about the 2 theoretical frameworks Petunia had found, which Harry had shared with her that morning in the library. "The second framework," Hermione said. "The sympathetic extraction model. It requires a different kind of magical event than the first one, but it's theoretically sound. If the fragment was attached involuntarily, which it was, that's established, then there's an argument that it's not fully integrated in the way a deliberately created Horcrux would be. Which means it might be removable without," Neville said. "Without the obvious alternative, yes." Hermione's voice was the measured one she used for things she'd thought about carefully and concluded positively. "It's not proven. The research is old and the methodology would need updating. But it's not nothing. It's something," Harry said. "It's a direction," she corrected. "Which is what we need." The feast began. Dumbledore rose for the end-of-year address, and the hall went through its usual quiet as 1,000 students gave him their attention, and Harry ate roast beef and watched. The address was different this year. He noticed immediately, not because of what was in it, but what was absent from it. The usual architecture of Dumbledore's public speech had a specific quality, a way of making the audience feel both safe and grateful, the benevolent patriarch taking stock of a year well managed. This was quieter. More direct. Less concerned with the impression it was making and more with the actual content. He thanked the students for their resilience during a difficult year. He acknowledged, explicitly, that the events of the year had raised questions about the school's safety that deserved serious answers, not dismissals. He said that those answers were being sought through a formal inquiry that would be transparent and that its findings would be shared. He named the students who had been petrified and said the school owed each of them an acknowledgement that they had been failed, and a commitment to do better. The hall was very quiet. He didn't name Harry. Didn't name the chamber, or the diary, or the basilisk. There were limits to what the end-of-year feast could carry. But the acknowledgement was there, in the structure of it. Something has been wrong and it is being addressed. Harry thought, small. Quiet. Honest. It was the beginning of something, not the whole thing. But beginnings were where everything lived. Then Dumbledore paused, and looked down the Gryffindor table, and said, "I want to take a moment, before we close, to say something that should have been said aloud in this room considerably earlier." The hall held. This school has benefited, for many years, from the assumption that good intentions are sufficient guarantee of good outcomes. He kept his voice measured. "I have operated under this assumption myself, and I have been wrong to do so. Good intentions that are not submitted to scrutiny, not tested against their consequences, not held accountable by the people they affect, such intentions can produce harm as real as any malicious act. I have been the beneficiary of a culture of trust that I did not always deserve, and I want you to know, as students who will go on to build the world after us, that trust given without the right to question it is not trust. It is a debt that eventually calls itself in. The silence was the particular kind that happened when something true arrived in a room too large for small sounds. Ask questions, Dumbledore said. Of me, of this institution, of each other. Ask them even when the answers are uncomfortable. Ask them especially then. He looked, briefly, toward Harry. Some of you already know how. He sat down. The hall was still for one more second, and then the noise returned, not the same noise as before, but changed in texture, the sound of 1,000 young people processing something unexpected and finding it interesting. Hermione was writing. Neville was looking at the faculty table with an expression that was complicated in a way that suited him. He'd always been better at complexity than simple reactions. Harry ate his roast beef and looked at the enchanted ceiling, which was showing the clear deep blue of a Scottish June evening with the first stars beginning to suggest themselves at the edges. He thought about Petunia at number 4, who had probably been awake since 5 waiting for his letter about how the feast went. He thought about writing it tonight, after the hall, in the dormitory with the others asleep around him and the castle quiet. He thought about what to put in it. Dumbledore spoke honestly in the feast. Not everything, but something. It was a beginning. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban, who was going to come out of it, because Harry had made it a condition rather than a request, and Dumbledore had heard the difference. He thought about what it would be like to meet him. He had Lily's letters about Sirius, the ones from before the war, when Sirius was James's best friend and Lily's unlikely ally and genuinely one of the funniest people she'd ever met. He thought about what 11 years in Azkaban did to a person and then thought about what getting out would do, and hoped the second thing was stronger than the first. He thought about the Horcrux in his scar. He thought about it the way he'd been thinking about it since Dumbledore told him, not with fear, not with the specific existential weight of a problem that has no solution, but with the focused attention of a problem that had not yet been solved and was therefore still in the category of things to work on. Petunia's 2 frameworks. Hermione's assessment. The Gringotts archives. The direction was there. The solution was not yet there, which was different from the solution not existing. He had been told, implicitly and explicitly, by the mythology around him, that there were things in his life that were fixed. The prophecy. The sacrifice. The narrative of the chosen child who walked willingly into the end of himself. He had been told this story was inevitable, that it was heroic, that the willingness to die for others was the highest possible expression of love and magic. He thought about Petunia on the doorstep in November 1981, a cold morning, a sleeping baby, a letter from a man who had already decided what that baby's life was for. He thought about her writing her own letter instead. He thought, the alternative to fixed is chosen. And choosing required having the full information, and having the full information required being the kind of person who demanded it rather than receiving what was curated. He had been raised to be that person. He picked up his pumpkin juice and drank it and looked around the great hall, 1,000 people eating and talking, ghosts drifting over the tables, candles floating in their quiet way, the castle's accumulated magic humming under everything the way it always did, warm and complex and vast. His world. It was actually his world, in the way Petunia had said, not because of the prophecy, not because of the scar, not because of what Dumbledore had decided his life was for. Because he was in it, and it was where Lily had been, and where James had been, and where Neville was and Hermione was and where things were happening that needed people who would look at them honestly. Neville leaned over. "What are you thinking?" "Nothing specific," Harry said. "Everything general." Neville considered this. "That's usually when you're about to do something." "Not tonight," Harry said. "Tonight we just eat dinner." Neville looked at him for a moment with the particular affectionate skepticism he'd developed over 9 months of knowing Harry. "Right," he said, and went back to his food. The feast wound down. Students began the organized chaos of departure, hugs, promises to write, the chaotic emotional arithmetic of friendships that have to survive a summer. Ron and his brothers were making noise at the far end of the table. Ginny gave Harry a small nod on the way past that meant something real. Draco Malfoy, across the hall, caught Harry's eye for a moment as the Slytherin table began to empty, and there was something in his face that was in process, uncertain in the way of someone who has received information that hasn't finished settling. His father was under ministry inquiry. The world was reorganizing around him. Harry gave him a brief, neutral nod. Draco returned it. On the train the next morning, Harry and Hermione and Neville took their usual compartment. Outside, the Scottish landscape went past in its summer iteration, greener, warmer, the sky very high and clear. Hermione had 3 books out before they left the station, which was very Hermione. Neville was reading a herbology journal with the concentration of someone who has found their thing and is joyfully in it. Harry wrote letters. He wrote to Petunia first, the full account of the past 3 days, the meeting, the feast, Dumbledore's speech. He wrote it clearly and without editorializing because she preferred facts and could draw her own conclusions. At the end he wrote, "He said you were remarkable." He said it like he meant it. I believe he did. Then, Sharpfang's preliminary Horcrux research arrives next week. I'll forward it when it comes. We're going to solve this. Then, Vernon was right about it being the same thing, being prepared and being extraordinary. I think I finally know what he meant. He wrote to Augusta Longbottom, thanking her for the meeting and confirming that the Wisengamot statement had been formally received by the inquiry board. He said that Neville was well and asked permission to share with Neville, from his own understanding, some of the information relevant to the Longbottom family history. He thought Neville should know. He thought not knowing was its own kind of harm. Augusta wrote back before King's Cross, she must have sent it from Hogsmeade, watching them depart, 1 sentence, tell him everything. He is ready. Harry folded the note and looked at Neville over the herbology journal. There are some things about your family, he said. That I know and you don't yet. I'd like to tell you, if that's all right. Neville set the journal down. He had his grandmother's quality of stillness when something important arrived. Now? If you want. Neville looked at Hermione, who was reading but was absolutely paying attention. He looked back at Harry. Yes, he said. Tell me. So Harry did. He told it the way he'd been taught to tell things, clearly, with respect for the person receiving it, with the distinction between facts and inferences maintained throughout. He told Neville about the guardianship irregularities and what they meant. He told him about the broader pattern, Dumbledore's adjacent presence at every point of crisis, what the evidence suggested and what it didn't yet prove. He told him about the inquiry and what it was likely to find. He told him, specifically, that what had happened to Frank and Alice Longbottom was not something that had happened in spite of the system that was supposed to protect them, but possibly because of weaknesses in it that nobody had held accountable. Neville listened. He didn't interrupt. His face was the face of someone building something, a structure, a framework to hang what he already knew on. When Harry finished, the train was moving through the Midlands, the landscape flattened into green fields and grey sky. Gran knew some of this, Neville said. Yes. She brought what she knew to the meeting. She didn't tell me. She was protecting you. In the way parents and grandparents sometimes protect people by not giving them things they're not sure they can carry. Harry looked at him. Your grandmother has decided you can carry it. Neville was quiet for a while. Then, I'm angry. That makes sense, Harry said. Not at you. Not even at Dumbledore, exactly, or not only. He looked out the window. At the whole, at the way it was just. Allowed. All of it. Everyone going along, nobody asking the questions that needed asking, because the person at the center of it was someone no one was supposed to question. Yes, Harry said. That's what you're changing, Neville said. It wasn't a question exactly. That's what we're changing, Harry said. Neville looked at him. Then at Hermione, who had set her book down at some point and was watching them both with the steady attention she brought to things that mattered to her. "All right," Neville said. "What do we do next?" "This summer, research," Harry said. "The Horcrux problem specifically, and whatever the inquiry turns up. In September, we go back and we keep building." He paused. "There's still Voldemort. I don't want to lose sight of that. Whatever we do about Dumbledore's history doesn't change the fact that there's a fractured soul trying to come back, and it will try, and we need to be ready." "Both things can be true," Hermione said. "He can have done genuine harm and Voldemort can be a genuine threat that needs addressing." "Yes," Harry said. "They're not in competition. They're both part of the same picture." The train moved south through the long summer afternoon, and the compartment was warm and quiet and full of the specific ease of people who have been through something difficult together and know they're going to go through more and have made their peace with that. Hermione went back to her book. Neville went back to his journal. Harry looked out the window and thought about Sirius, who had not yet been told there was someone on the outside working to get him out. He thought about writing to him, not through normal channels, which would be monitored, but through Sharpfang, who had access to approved communication with Azkaban for account management purposes. He thought about what to say. "I'm James's son. I have your file. I'm getting you out. Hold on." Simple. True. Enough. He wrote it on a piece of parchment in the small precise handwriting that was also slightly his aunt's, folded it, addressed it to Sharpfang for forwarding, and tucked it in his robe's pocket with the other letters. The train pulled into King's Cross at 6 in the evening. Vernon was on the platform, solid and familiar in his good suit, because he always wore his good suit to collect Harry from school as though it were an occasion worth dressing for, which Harry had found embarrassing at 9 and found quietly moving at 12. He spotted them through the barrier crowd and raised a hand with a smile that was comprehensive in its welcome. Petunia was beside him. Harry had not expected her. She usually stayed home. She found the platform complicated, the magical proximity, the crowd of wizarding families doing the ordinary extraordinary thing of reunion. She was in her good coat, the grey wool one, standing in the middle of King's Cross with the particular stillness she had, and when she saw Harry come through the barrier she did the thing she always did, the small private exhale that meant "there you are." Harry walked through the crowd to her and she put her arms around him without preamble and he put his arms around her, and they stood there in the noise and movement of King's Cross Station with the summer around them and a year's worth of things accomplished held between them. "The feast," she said, quietly, against his shoulder. He said it, Harry said. Publicly. In front of everyone. She was quiet for a moment. "It's not enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not yet. But it's the beginning." She pulled back and looked at him, assessing, the way she always did, checking the shape of him for what a year had done and whether it had done it well. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she gave him the smallest nod and then turned to Vernon, who was shaking Neville's hand with the enthusiasm of a man who has been hearing about Neville for 9 months and is pleased to confirm he exists. Hermione's parents were nearby, waiting with the particular expression of muggles who come to this platform twice a year and have long since accepted that it is simply where they pick up their daughter from a school they can never see. Hermione's mother hugged her and said something in her ear that made Hermione's expression go soft in a way it almost never did in school. Harry watched it all and felt the summer beginning around him, the long days ahead, the research, the work, the letters and the documents and the slow, patient building of what came next. He felt the copper-electric sensation in his awareness, steady and present, the magical world humming under everything the way it always had. He thought about the summer and what it held, the Horcrux research, the inquiry findings, Sirius, the meeting with Dumbledore that would happen before September when Dumbledore came to Privet Drive as agreed to review the documentation plan with Petunia. He thought about all of it the way he thought about all large and complex things, as a structure that could be mapped, as a problem that could be approached, as a truth that was going to make it into the light regardless of how many people had preferred it in the dark. He picked up his trunk. "Right," he said. Let's go home. Petunia walked beside him through King's Cross, and Vernon was telling Neville something about drilling machinery that Neville was listening to with genuine interest, and Hermione was already reading in the back of her parents' car at the curb, and the summer was large and open and full of work, and Harry thought, this is enough. This is more than enough. This is everything, actually. He thought about Lily, which he did every day, in the small private ongoing way that was just his. I have her eyes, he thought. I have her stubbornness, Petunia says. I have something she put into me that I still don't fully understand. But I'm learning. He thought about the scar on his forehead, and the fragment of something dark that lived in it, and the two theoretical frameworks that might mean it didn't have to end the way someone had planned. He thought, not fixed. Chosen. He came out of King's Cross into the London evening, into the noise and the movement and the ordinary extraordinary fact of a city that didn't know and didn't need to know what was being assembled inside it, what documents and decisions and slow patient work was building toward a truth that had no master, that belonged to no one's narrative and no one's design, that was just itself, accurate and eventual and coming. Petunia put on her sunglasses. Walk faster, she said. Vernon double-parked. Harry laughed, and walked faster, and the summer began.